Chapter 968. Although Li Yundong had a strong self-control, he was shocked to see Zhang Tianshi with only half of his body left. He widened his eyes and cried out involuntarily, "Zhenren Zhang Yub." However, Zhang Tianshi's expression remained the same. He stretched out his hand, bowed, and said with a smile, "Zhenren Li, thank you." Li Yundong returned the salute and said in surprise, "Zhenren Zhang, you haven't come out of seclusion for the past 10 years. Is it because—" Li Yundong swallowed his words and didn't say anything else. Zhang Tianshi smiled and said, "Zhenren Li, why do you think I lost my legs?" Li Yundong shook his head and said, "Destiny is not my strong point. I can't guess." Zhang Tianshi grabbed the empty clothes below his waist and smiled. Although his smile was open-minded, it revealed a sense of vicissitudes and helplessness. He said, "From the moment I was born, I was instilled with the idea of promoting Xueqi school and restoring the glory of our school. Unfortunately, during the Republic of China period, our Xueqi school stood on the wrong side one after another. In the end, the atheists who believed in the Communist Party seized the world. From that moment on, Zhang Enpu, the leader of our Xueqi school, knew that the end of Dharma was coming. From then on, he tried his best to preserve the strength of our school and told the future disciples of our school to compromise and find the right time to make a comeback." Celestial Master Zhang said slowly. Every word revealed the helplessness under the torrent of history. Every sentence revealed the vicissitudes of the great era. Even a great cultivator like him could not transcend the changes of the dynasties and the changes of the world. He could not escape from the customs. Zhang Tianshi said, "In the early days of the founding of New China, our Xueqi sect was caught in a fierce internal strife. Because our Xueqi sect had always been with the Kuomintang, and later the Kuomintang seized the country, many people in the sect insisted on going to Taiwan with the Kuomintang. Some people thought that we should stick to the ancestral court and not leave. At the same time, some people suggested that we should cross the ocean and leave this troublesome place. They thought that China had fallen into the end of the age of Dharma, and there would be a great calamity in the future. Those who stayed would suffer greatly. If there's a way out, I'll definitely go to a foreign country." Speaking of this, Zhang Tianshi lowered his head and smiled slightly. He said with great emotion, "When I first heard this, I was still young and didn't take it seriously. I thought that no matter who sat on the throne in the world, in the end, they would still have to rely on our Xueqi school. Our celestial master Zhang's clan is known as a 1,000-year-old aristocratic family, with Zhang in the south and Kong in the north. How could it be a joke? But it turns out that I was wrong, very wrong." Zhang Tianshi sighed and said with a heavy breath, "You know what happened later. Our Xueqi school was divided into 3 factions. One faction followed Chiang Kai-shek of the Kuomintang to Taiwan, and the one who left was Zhang Enpu, the current leader of our Xueqi school. The other faction took some of the backbone and left for a foreign country. It was Zhang Tianfang, the founder of the Shen-Tian sect. The rest were the most useless and hopeless group of people, and I was forced to be the leader." As Zhang Tianshi spoke, he smiled at Li Yundong and said, "At that time, I was just a child. My cultivation was low and my experience was shallow. No one was convinced by me, let alone those Shishu and Sherbua in Taiwan or overseas. When I took over the Xueqi school, it was an unprecedented mess, but after so many years of painstaking management, I finally managed to manage the Xueqi school a little bit, especially when I found a rare genius." Zhang Tianshi's eyes lit up. He stared at Li Yundong and said, "Do you know who I'm talking about?" Li Yundong listened attentively. His heart skipped a beat and he asked tentatively, "Wang Yuanshan?" Zhang Tianshi laughed and nodded approvingly at Li Yundong, saying, "Yes, it's Wang Yuanshan. His talent is extremely high, far above mine. In time, his cultivation will definitely reach the peak, enough to carry forward the glory of our Xueqi school." Li Yundong couldn't help sighing and said, "Zhenren Zhang, is a person's strength really that important?" Zhang Tianshi said disapprovingly, "Of course. Throughout the 5,000 years of Chinese history, the rise of a country, a religion, and a sect all rose because of the rise of one person, and all became strong because of the strength of one person. The Qin dynasty had Xiangyang, so the 7 countries dominated. The Han dynasty had Emperor Wu, so his prestige shook the distant countries. The Tang dynasty had Emperor Taizong, so he came from all directions. The Yuan dynasty had Temujin, so his iron hooves trampled all over Europe. The Ming dynasty had Zhu Di, so it had a strong Ming. A country is like this, a religion is like this, a sect is like this, and even a family is like this. Zhenren Li, if you hadn't inexplicably inherited the position of leader of the Fox Zen school, I'm afraid that it would have been destroyed long ago. You can't deny this fact, can you? Li Yundong was silent for a while. Although he agreed in his heart, he felt more helpless inside. It was also because of this that China had always been a society ruled by people, not a society ruled by law. From beginning to end, it was people who managed the country, not a sound legal system. When the people who managed it were wise and powerful, no one in the world could stop the Chinese people from sweeping everything. When the people who managed it were stupid, the Chinese people would fall into complete chaos and internal strife. Li Yundong was deep in thought, but Zhang Tianxue didn't notice it. He continued to say with some emotion, "After I found Wang Yuanshan, I immediately decided to help him cultivate with everything I had. Wang Yuanshan lived up to my expectations and became the youngest Jingxian master in the Chinese cultivation world. But the world is changeable, and fate is unpredictable. I didn't expect that he was destined to have a love tribulation." Li Yundong blurted out, "Ao Wushuang?" Zhang Tianxue nodded and said, "Yes. This seven-tailed fox spirit disrupted all my arrangements. She made Wang Yuanshan resolutely abandon my high regard for him and the heavy burden of the sect. In the end, he betrayed the sect." When Zhang Tianxue said this, his expression was extremely gloomy, as if he was still upset, guilty, and sad about Wang Yuanshan's matter. He said slowly, "You know what happened later. But after I caught him 10 years ago and decided to seal him up, I knew that I could no longer rely on him. I had to find another way out. Although I knew that there would be one catastrophe after another in the Chinese cultivation world 10 years later, and that our Zhengyi school would also face great disasters, all of this was predestined. It was reincarnation, karma, and fate. But I was unwilling. I wanted to try to go against heaven. I wanted to use my own strength to change the world." Celestial Master Zhang let out a deep laugh, his hand grabbing the robe around his legs. Li Yundong saw this and his heart skipped a beat. He had already understood something. Sure enough, Zhang Tianxue continued to say, "I'm not very talented, and I can be said to be a little clumsy. The reason why I can reach this realm today is very simple. It's nothing more than hard work." Zhang Tianxue smiled and said, "There are some things that can be made up for by hard work, but some people who work hard for a lifetime can't compare to some people who cultivate for a year." As Zhang Tianxue spoke, he looked at Li Yundong with a smile in his eyes and said, "Zhenren Li, don't you think so?" Li Yundong knew that Zhang Tianxue was talking about him. He bowed slightly and said, "I don't dare." "Zhenren Zhang, are you being too hasty?" Zhang Tianxue smiled and said, "Being too hasty? That's right. Isn't he being too hasty? In order to break through to the Thunder Retribution realm as soon as possible, I ended up being possessed by the devil and my lower body was completely paralyzed." Li Yundong said curiously, "But, Zhenren Zhang Yub." Li Yundong looked at Zhang Tianxue's empty Taoist robe with a face full of doubts. Even if he had been possessed by the devil, he wouldn't have lost both of his legs, would he? Zhang Tianxue guessed what Li Yundong was thinking. He smiled and said, "At that time, I was possessed by the devil and half of my body was paralyzed. My legs were completely reduced to rotten flesh. If I kept them, I would have to spend a part of my spiritual power and junqi on them every day. So I simply cut them off myself." Li Yundong was shocked. He was already very shocked when he saw Yan Feng cut off her own family jewels, but he hadn't expected that Zhang Tianxue would cut off both of his legs. What kind of boldness was that? Li Yundong looked at Zhang Tianxue with his mouth agape and was speechless for a moment. However, Zhang Tianxue smiled casually and said, "It's all in the past. Zhenren Li, I haven't seen anyone for 10 years. Do you know why I called you in today, apart from telling you this?" Li Yundong shook his head and asked, "Please enlighten me, Zhenren Zhang." Zhang Tianxue smiled and said, "In the chess game just now, I believe that Zhenren Li is a gentleman and will not take advantage of others, so I have a favor to ask of you." Li Yundong was shocked. If Zhang Tianxue had something to ask of him, then it must be a serious matter. He couldn't help asking, "What is it?" "As long as I can help, I won't refuse." Zhang Tianxue smiled and his expression became serious. He said, "Zhenren Li, I once calculated that there are 2 disasters in the Chinese cultivation world that we can't avoid. One is the resurrection of the black fox, and the other is the devil dance. Our Xueqi school will soon face a disaster. We escaped the disaster in the resurrection of the Black Fox, but I don't know if we can avoid it next time. And I'm about to die. If Zhenren Li is still in the world in the future, if it's convenient, you might as well take care of the Xueqi school. Please. After that, Zhang Tianshi bowed deeply. Li Yundong quickly stepped forward and helped him up. He said, Zhenren Zhang, what are you talking about? In this Dharma-ending era, the cultivators of the world are one family. When the disaster comes, we should help each other. Li Yundong's heart skipped a beat and he asked, Zhenren Zhang, what about Deng Yu and Deng Jiao's? Zhang Tianshi laughed and said, Don't worry, Zhenren Li. I will definitely make proper arrangements for this matter. Hearing this, Li Yundong was relieved. Finally, he had not been busy in vain. He thought for a moment. Although he felt that it was a little too much to take advantage of, he still said, Zhenren Zhang, that Zi Yuanch. Before he could finish speaking, Zhang Tianshi shook his head and said, Zhenren Li, I can't help you with this matter. The country has its laws, and the sect has its dogma. Zi Yuan has violated the rules of the sect, so she will definitely be punished, but I won't lock her up. I should expel her from the sect. Speaking of this, Zhang Tianshi raised his head, looked at Li Yundong sincerely, and said, Zhenren Li, why don't you start your own sect? With your strength and cultivation, it's enough for you to establish a sect in the Chinese cultivation world and establish your own mountain. Li Yundong was stunned. This was not the first time someone had mentioned this matter in front of him. In the past, it was usually the people around him who had mentioned it. Although Li Yundong had thought about it, he had not seriously considered it. However, this time, it was an important figure in the Chinese cultivation world who had mentioned it. Li Yundong thought to himself, maybe it's really time to set up my own sect. Uneasy face. Chapter 969. A long time after Li Yundong left, Zhang Tianshi said to Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, who were still waiting for news outside, Deng Yu, Deng Jiao. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao trembled and said in unison, Sect leader Xueqi. Li Yundong and Zhang Tianshi played a game of chess on the main peak of Mount Longhu with the sky as the chessboard and the clouds as the chess pieces. Although it didn't last long, it was majestic and intense, which still shocked the two sisters. They saw that Li Yundong had not come out of the main door after entering, and were muttering in their hearts. When they heard Zhang Tianshi's voice, they suddenly became nervous and waited for their fate to be announced. Bubble Zhang Tianshi's voice was calm, and the two little girls couldn't detect how angry he was. Zhang Tianshi said, Deng Yu, Deng Jiao, you two let Zi Yuan go without authorization, which has violated the rules of our Xueqi school. You should be confined for 10 years and then expelled from the sect. Although Li Yundong pleaded for you, there are laws in the country and rules in the family. You can't do anything without rules. You should pack up your things now and go down the mountain quickly. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao felt as if they had been struck by lightning. Deng Jiao suddenly raised her head and exclaimed, Sect leader martial uncle, everything is my fault. It has nothing to do with my sister. Sect leader martial uncle, please be merciful and don't punish my sister. Let her stay. Zhang Tianshi snorted and said, It's understandable and unforgivable. You two don't have to say any more. Hurry down the mountain and find a famous teacher. There's no place for you on Mount Longhu anymore. Deng Yu was shocked at first and subconsciously wanted to beg for mercy, but she bit her lip and swallowed the words that had rushed to her mouth. She grabbed Deng Jiao, who was still begging, and said, Sister, don't say any more. Let's go. Deng Jiao's eyes were filled with tears. She turned her head and said, But. Deng Yu winked at her and said, Sister, sect leader Xueqi has already asked us to go down the mountain and find a famous teacher. Didn't you hear him? Deng Jiao was stunned for a moment, but she quickly reacted. Her body was pulled by Deng Yu, and she couldn't help but lie down. Deng Yu said, Sect leader Xueqi, please allow us to call you that for the last time. We'll go first. You, take care. Celestial Master Zhang leaned against the wall. Seeing that Deng Yu and Deng Jiao had understood what he was implying, he could not help but smile. He had always been worried that these two girls would stubbornly refuse to leave Mount Longhu. If that were to happen, all of his plans would be for naught. Now that the two girls were clever and quick-witted, they quickly understood his intentions and obediently left. This was simply a joyous occasion for everyone. Zhang would be With that, Tian, Yu, Jiao, Yundong, Yu, Jiao, Yu, and Yundong. After Deng Yu and Deng Jiao left the Immortal Dawn Cave, they went to the side hall of the Celestial Master Mansion and found Zhang Ling to bid farewell. However, Zhang Ling was not there, so the two of them could only bid farewell to their senior brothers and sisters. Although the two of them had not been on Mount Longhu for a long time, they were not only as beautiful as flowers, but also as extremely rare twin lotus flowers. Although their temperaments were different, they were extremely likable. There was no one in the Xueqi school who did not like them. At this time, seeing that they were going to leave the mountain, no one dared to ask them to stay, although they were reluctant. After all, this was an order from Zhang Tianshi himself. Among them, Zhang Lufang, who had the best relationship with them, sent them all the way down the mountain. The inner disciple of the Xueqi school held hands and looked at each other with tears in her eyes. While wiping her tears, she said to Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, "You two must remember to come to see me often in the future." The first time Deng Yu and Deng Jiao saw this world after they were reborn was in the Xueqi school of Mount Longhu. Although they knew that it was not Mount Longhu that saved their lives, they still had a strong sense of belonging to Mount Longhu. This was like a small animal that had just broken out of its shell. The first thing it saw would subconsciously be its mother. It was also like if a child was taken care of by another person for a long time and did not stay by his mother's side. After a long time, he would also be separated from his mother. The sisters were also crying. They each took Zhang Liufang's hand and kept nodding, saying, "Yes, Shiji Lufang, you must come to see us often in the future." Zhang Lufang wiped her tears and said, "Where can I go to see you?" This question stumped both Deng Yu and Deng Jiao. Both of them were stunned at the same time. Seeing them like this, Zhang Lufang couldn't help but feel even more sad for them. Yes, where will they go in the future? Go home? But they had been dead for almost a year, and the public security organ had removed their files. They were already dead people in the mortal world. Now that they had reappeared, how could they explain it to their parents? Could they say that they had met Zi Yuan and Ruan Hongling of the Linggong sect, saved Deng Yu and Deng Jiao's lives, and then were reborn in Mount Longhu? Even Deng Yu and Deng Jiao's own parents wouldn't believe it, would they? If this got out, would they be sent to a mental hospital in the future? Would I have to go to a mental hospital to see them in the future? At this time, the two sisters were also crying, and Zhang Lufang also cried. She became more and more sad, and tears fell down her cheeks. Zhang Lufang comforted them, "Don't be sad. The world is so big, where can't you go? In my opinion, you might as well go to Li Wudi. Don't you have a good relationship with him? I think he will take you in for the sake of your friendship in the past." Deng Yu and Deng Jiao looked at each other at this time, and their hearts moved. They quickly broke into smiles, wiped their tears, and said to Zhang Lufang, "Shiji Liufang's words make sense. After we go down the mountain, we will go to him." Zhang Lufang originally thought that she would have to persuade them for a long time, but she didn't expect the two sisters to be so obedient. She was a little tongue-tied and didn't know what to say for a while. Deng Yu and Deng Jiao took Zhang Liufang's hand and said intimately, "Shiji Lufang, we'll go first. You can go back first. We'll come to see you often in the future." Zhang Lufang waved her hand in a daze, then watched the two sisters walk away hand in hand. When the two of them disappeared, Zhang Lufang was a little tongue-tied and said, "They're really happy-go-lucky, huh? Have they calmed down so quickly? Amazing." Zhang Lufang didn't know that as soon as Zhang Tianshi had asked Deng Yu and Deng Jiao to go down the mountain, Deng Yu had immediately reacted. She recalled the hidden meaning of Zhang Tianshi's words. Go down the mountain and find a good teacher. The two sisters were connected. One reacted quickly, and the other reacted very quickly. Therefore, although they were a little sad, it was not as serious as Zhang Lufang had thought. After Deng Yu and Deng Jiao went down the mountain, they looked back at the foot of the mountain, only to see that the Taoist master's mansion had been hidden in the mountains and forests. They couldn't see the carved railings and jade walls, but they could see the faint rising of incense. Although it was not very vigorous, it was always faintly discernible and had not been cut off. For a moment, the two sisters were filled with emotion. They knelt down and respectfully kowtowed 3 times, then turned and left hand in hand. Not long after the two of them left, Zhang Ling received the news that Deng Yu and Deng Jiao had left. The impatient lady of the earthly fire suddenly flew into a rage. She immediately wanted to chase after Han Xin, but as soon as she moved, she was stopped by the other disciples of the Xueqi school, who said that this was an order from Zhang Tianchi. Zhang Ling was so angry that her head was dizzy. She stomped her feet and went straight to the Immortal Glow Cave. From afar, she shouted angrily, "Xueqi, are you crazy? Why did you really expel Deng Yu and Deng Jiao from the sect? Just punish them with a period of confinement. Xueqi, how many good seedlings are left in our Xueqi school now?" It was not easy to find these two, but Yub. Zhang Tianchi seemed to have been waiting for Zhang Ling to come to him and say these words. He didn't wait for Zhang Ling to finish speaking, so he sighed in a deep voice and said, "Xueqi, do you think I don't understand what you are saying? Those who know me say that I am worried, and those who don't know me say that I want something. You don't have to say it. You will understand what I mean in the future." Zhang Ling knew that although her Shidi's talent was not top-notch compared to the previous leaders, he was experienced and prudent in doing things. He would think twice before he acted, and there must be a deep meaning in everything he did. She gradually calmed down and asked, "Xueqi, did you let them go for the sake of our Xueqi school?" Zhang Tianchi was silent for a while, then sighed and said, "Xueqi, I have done what I should do. The rest is up to fate. In the future, I will have to trouble you to take care of the affairs of the sect." Zhang Ling ran over angrily to denounce Celestial Master Zhang, but her anger dissipated with just a few words from Celestial Master Zhang. Although she still had doubts in her heart, she finally stopped asking. She sighed and glanced at the cave abode with some doubt and worry. She faintly felt that there was something wrong with Zhang Tianchi's voice and tone, but she couldn't tell what was wrong. She had to turn around and leave with a heavy heart. After Zhang Tianchi sent away the sisters Deng Yu and Deng Jiao, as well as his Xueqi Zhang Ling, he looked up at the sky and muttered to himself, "There's not much time left. There's still one last thing left." After that, he took a deep breath. The Jin Yang spirit came out of its shell and flew in the direction of Dongwu City. At this time, in the distant Dongwu City, Yan Feng was quietly hiding in a street in the old city of Suzhou. She was silent and motionless, like a cold stone. But in Yan Feng's heart, it was beating violently, burning and burning. The news that the Qiankuan Rui mirror was with her had inadvertently spread. She believed that it would not be long before all the cultivators in the world knew that she had this coveted powerful magical weapon. At that time, countless people would flock to her. In such a dilemma, Yan Feng knew that she couldn't wait like this. She had no way out, so she had to make a last stand. This cold and tenacious cultivator waited quietly in the corner of the alley, until a graceful and beautiful figure appeared gracefully. Yan Feng looked over and saw that this person had an oval face and a cherry mouth. She had a delicate and charming face. It was the only disciple she had accepted in the past 10 years. Song Yuqiao. Chapter 970. Yan Feng hid the treasure, and Yuqiao was robbed. Song Yuqiao walked gracefully from the entrance of the street. She had a delicate and timid face, beautiful and lovely. At this time, she was wearing a thin yellow cotton-padded jacket and a pair of navy blue patterned cotton pants. Although it was early spring and she had a little more clothes on her body, it still couldn't hide her graceful figure. Song Yuqiao's slender waist bent 3 times with each step. Although her face was calm, there seemed to be a kind of shyness hidden between her eyebrows, which made people want to protect her. Song Yuqiao walked slowly. Every step was very slow and light, like a vigilant little rabbit. As long as there was the slightest movement, she would immediately run away. Ever since Song Yuqiao had broken down and fled under the tremendous pressure in the Taoist assembly, she had been hiding for a long time. It was not until she felt that things had calmed down that she came out again. Song Yuqiao was different from other cultivators. She was not a cultivator in the strict sense of the word. Yan Feng had accepted her as a disciple purely by chance. There was only a master-disciple relationship, and there was no gratitude for teaching her. When Yan Feng had been lurking in the Fox Zen school and disguised as Mo Ashi, she had come to Dongwu City to investigate Ao Wushuang and met this typical Jiangnan woman, Song Yuqiao. In this world, so long as a girl was slightly beautiful, there would more or less be a boy pestering her and attracting the attention of bees and butterflies. However, if she was born with a natural beauty and always carried a trace of shyness and timidity between her brows, it would arouse the tender affection of others, and she had an extremely weak character. It was simply enough to make most men go crazy. Song Yuqiao was such a person. She was not as charming as Su Chan, not as otherworldly as Zi Yuan, not as generous as Zhou Qin, not as coquettish as Chao Kefi, not as lively and lovely as Zhang Lufeng, Deng Yu, and Deng Zhao, but there was a desire in her bones that made people want to protect her, love her, and even destroy her. If a girl like her had been born in a rich family like Xueqi and had a strong background, she might have lost a lot of freedom, but her life would have been smooth and she would not have been troubled by always having lechers around her. However, she had been born in a poor family. Her father had died early, and her mother was an old Pingtan artist in Donggu City. Although her attainments were not shallow, and her authentic Donggu dialect and old-school singing were unique, under the impact of the market economy, the Pingtan business was deteriorating, and the family's livelihood was very difficult. Children from poor families took charge of the family early, so Song Yuqiao had dropped out of school early and learned Pingtan from her mother. Then, at a young age, she appeared in public and sang pingshu and opera. For such a beautiful girl like her to appear in public all day long, she was simply like a delicate little rabbit running around in the forest all day long. As the saying goes, if you walk too much at night, you will run into ghosts. If you stay in the forest for a long time, you will run into wolves sooner or later. Song Yuqiao's beauty had finally attracted the attention of some unscrupulous people. However, although the little girl was young and shy, she had a firm opinion on major issues and would never entangle herself with these shady people. Therefore, these unscrupulous people wanted to use force out of shame and anger. When Song Yuqiao was caught by them and struggled in vain, she met Yan Fong in despair. At a young age, Song Yuqiao saw a movie and TV for the first time. The so-called immortals in the romance of the Song dynasty appeared in front of her. She was impressed by Yan Fong's amazing skills, and a thought emerged in the depths of her heart. If I can have such skills, my mother and I will not be bullied in the future. Therefore, Song Yuqiao immediately fell to her knees and begged Yan Fong to accept her as a disciple. Yan Fong was a rare beauty. 10 years ago, she was known as the first beauty in the Chinese cultivation world, and all beauties had very high standards. It was absolutely impossible for her to accept a disciple who was not beautiful. This was also why Wang Yuanshan had accepted 2 disciples, while she had not accepted any before. There was no other reason than that she didn't like them. However, when Yan Fong saw Song Yuqiao for the first time, she was attracted by her appearance and pitiful temperament. She took advantage of the situation and accepted her as a disciple. After that, she had been lurking in the Fox Zen school and had no chance to teach this disciple. She had only taught her a few talismans to protect herself. She felt a little sorry, so after thinking about it, she simply let her join the Gazao sect of the external alchemy. On the one hand, she could enter the external alchemy and add a chess eye for her own layout. On the other hand, she hoped that Song Yuqiao could learn some magic in the external alchemy to make up for her guilt a little. However, Yan Fong did not expect that life would not go her way. 9 out of 10, the chess piece she had painstakingly cultivated would collapse at the last moment because she could not bear the huge pressure and turn to escape. What Song Yuqiao didn't expect was that after she thought she had escaped, her master would catch up with her and punish her. But in the end, her master didn't catch up with her. What was even more unexpected was that she thought she had hidden in the end and didn't show up, so her master and those terrible people at the Taoist assembly couldn't find her. But in the end, she was still found by Yan Fong. Yan Fong had never thought of looking for Song Yuqiao before, because in her opinion, this disciple was really a little disappointing and useless. She was not like herself at all. She did not have a ruthless and indomitable spirit, so she planned to end the relationship with Song Yuqiao in this way. But when she found the Heaven and Earth Rui Mirror and found that she was not the destined master of the Heaven and Earth Rui Mirror, she began to think about a question. How should she deal with this supreme magic treasure? Take it with her? That would be courting death. Hide it in a place? But where should she hide it? If she hid it in a deserted place, she was afraid that it would be taken away by someone accidentally. Yan Fong was a paranoid and manipulative woman. If she fell in love with a man, she must have him. If she had something very important, she must carry it with her all day long. She wished she could see it all the time. At the very least, she must put it in a place where she could rest assured. Therefore, after thinking about it for a long time, Yan Fong finally thought of Song Yuqiao. Yan Fong knew Song Yuqiao very well. She knew that she was an extremely filial daughter and would never be far away from her mother. She also knew that she was cautious and not greedy, so she decided to hide the powerful magic treasure with Song Yuqiao. But she was afraid that there would be a mishap, so she did not tell Song Yuqiao. She just hid the powerful magic treasure in Song Yuqiao's home and left a note. If one day Song Yuqiao accidentally found this note, She would help her keep it out of the original relationship between master and disciple. She would not rashly sell it. Song Yuqiao didn't expect that Yan Fong would hide such a terrible time bomb beside her without her knowing it. She walked gently on the antique bluestone floor all the way to the end of the alley and came to a house with white walls and black tiles. She opened the wooden door and copper lock on the left and right side of the door. After pushing the door open, she came to a yard. What was different from usual was that as soon as Song Yuqiao entered the house, she saw a middle-aged man in a Taoist robe standing in the yard. This middle-aged man was quite handsome, and he had a wisp of beard under his chin, which made him look a little elegant. He stood in the yard with empty hands, looking with interest at some vegetables and a few poultry strolling in the yard. It was not until Song Yuqiao came in that his eyes fell on her. Song Yuqiao was shocked. She looked at the Taoist priest who had suddenly appeared with vigilance and timidity. She subconsciously took a step back and whispered timidly, "Who are you? Why are you in my house?" This middle-aged man was none other than Yin Kong, who had followed Yan Fong here. Yan Fong had been waiting here for a long time, and he had also been patient. Anyone who could cultivate to the Jinshin phase was a person of great wisdom. They were extremely smart and had amazing reactions. When he saw that Yan Fong had been hiding in this old street and staring at this house, he more or less understood something in his heart. Especially when he saw Song Yuqiao appear, Yan Fong's aura had obviously changed, and he was even more enlightened. Therefore, before Yan Fong appeared, he took the initiative to enter the yard without anyone noticing. Yin Kong looked at Song Yuqiao with a smile, and there was a touch of surprise in his eyes. In his opinion, Song Yuqiao was a natural furnace, a good material and a beautiful jade. He couldn't help but love talent again. However, compared with the heaven and earth Rui mirror, he valued powerful magical weapons more, so he suppressed his love for talent a little. Yin Kong smiled slightly and said, "What a beautiful little girl. Her eyebrows are clear, her eyes are pure, and she has no distracting thoughts. No wonder you left the powerful magical weapon with her. No wonder, no wonder." Song Yuqiao was confused by his words and couldn't help but ask timidly, "What are you talking about? Who the hell are you? If you don't tell me, I will shout. I will shout." Yin Kong laughed and said, "What a naive little girl. If I tell you my name, will you stop shouting?" Song Yuqiao was stunned when she heard this, and her pretty face turned red. She said timidly, "If you are a good person, I won't shout. If you are a bad person, I will still shout." Yin Kong laughed. His voice was not loud, but it shook the soles of Song Yuqiao's feet. She thought to herself, "This person should be a cultivator like master, right? Why did he come here?" Song Yuqiao was timid and afraid, so she involuntarily retracted her hand into her sleeve and tightly held a talisman that had been hidden close to her body. It was the 5 Thunder Righteous talisman that Li Yundong had used to attract the heavenly thunder. Seeing that Song Yuqiao was speaking naively, Yin Kong couldn't help laughing. His figure flashed, and in an instant, he appeared next to Song Yuqiao. He pressed his palm on the top of her head and said in a clear voice, "Yan Fong, if you don't show up, I'm afraid your precious disciple won't be able to see the sun tomorrow." What? Chapter 971. When Yin Kong's palm pressed on the top of Song Yuqiao's head, the beautiful girl of Dongwu City trembled with fear. She hadn't expected that after hiding for a long time, everything would come to her in the end. Her teeth kept chattering, and she shouted in horror in her heart, "I'm dead, I'm dead." The little girl cried out in fear in her heart, but when she heard Yin Kong say the name of her master, Yan Fong, Song Yuqiao suddenly shivered, like a drowning person who had seen a life-saving straw. She grabbed it like crazy and did not move. Bubble Song Yuqiao shouted loudly, "Master! Help! Help!" She was originally a pitiful little girl, extremely lovable. At this time, in a moment of desperation, she blurted out the Dongwu dialect. The Dongwu dialect was also known as Wu Nong soft language, and the illusion of Wu Nong soft language came from Chapter 76 of 20 Years of Observation of the Present Situation. The people they called to serve the wine were all from the southern troop. For a moment, the sound of birds chirping was all Wu Nong soft language. The biggest characteristics of Wu Nong soft language were that it was soft, crisp, sticky, and soft. Especially for girls, especially young and beautiful girls, when they spoke Wu Nong soft language, they really got the essence of the 4 words, soft, crisp, sticky, and soft. In the Ming and Qing dynasties, Jinling and Gusu were famous places of prosperity for thousands of years, with hundreds of miles of gentleness. The girls of Gusu were famous all over the world. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, there were not many famous prostitutes from Gusu, but the Wu Nong soft language from Xueqi spread all over the world. All the prostitutes in the 8 great hutongs of Beijing were proud of speaking Wu Nong soft language. If they could not speak Wu Nong soft language fluently, they would not be regarded as famous prostitutes, and they would even be embarrassed to say hello to people when they went out. If outsiders entered the brothels of the 8 great hutongs, it was guaranteed that they would be full of soft Wu Nong soft language, and those who did not know would think that they had come to the land of Donggu. Even in Beijing during the Republic of China period, the famous prostitutes in the 8 great alleys still spoke fluent Dongwu Chinese. When they met, they were outstanding beauties with red lips and white teeth, and when they opened their mouths, they spoke in soft Wu Nong language. It was really breathtaking and tempting to see them. If Song Yuqiao had been born in ancient times, she would have been a famous prostitute who could have left her mark in history. She was born with a good voice. Her voice was clear and soft. Even if she didn't sing and just spoke softly, she seemed to be able to stretch out an invisible hook and accurately hook a man's throbbing heartstrings. Yin Kong had cultivated for decades, but he had never seen such a beautiful woman. When he first saw her, he was moved. He loved her talent and couldn't bear to hurt her. At this time, when he heard her call him in such a soft Wu Nong language, he really felt sorry for her. Even though he had cultivated for many years and his mind was as firm as iron, he couldn't help but be moved and almost lost his Taoist heart. Yin Kong couldn't help but say to Song Yuqiao kindly, "Little girl, don't shout, be obedient. As long as your master is obedient and returns the things of our Zhengyi school to me, I won't hurt you." In all fairness, not only was Yin Kong not ugly, but he could also be considered handsome. However, he had appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time. Song Yuqiao's first impression of him was that he was a big villain. At this time, even if he explained it to her, she would never believe it. Although Song Yuqiao was always timid and didn't seem to have an idea, she was actually very determined in her heart. At the Taoist assembly, when Yan Fong had forced her like this, she had been able to hold on to the kindness in the depths of her heart. In the end, she hadn't killed her and had turned around to escape. Therefore, how could the words of Yin Kong shake her mind? The little girl's tears rolled down, but deep in her heart, she firmly believed that although he looked like a good person, this uncle must be a bad person. Didn't all the bad guys in the movies and TV shows look like this? Seeing her tears rolling down her cheeks, Yin Kong couldn't help but reach out to help her wipe her tears. Song Yuqiao also seemed to be scared silly and didn't move at all. Seeing that she didn't struggle at all, Yin Kong felt that the little girl was more and more obedient in his heart. He said loudly, "Yan Fong, how long are you going to hide? Do you think that I don't know where you hid the things now? You've been waiting here for a long time, and I've been waiting here for a long time. If you want to escape now, even though the sky is vast and the earth is thick, there's no place for you to hide. Why don't we get straight to the point and speak frankly? Isn't that better?" After he said this, Yan Fong, who had been hiding in the dark corner of the alley, finally came out. As soon as she came out, Song Yuqiao was stunned. She couldn't help but stare at Yan Fong and say, "Who are you? You're not my master." Yin Kong raised his head and laughed, saying, "Little girl, although it's said that seeing is believing and hearing is believing, sometimes what you see is not necessarily true. But sometimes, what you see on the surface may not be the truth." Yan Fong didn't even look at Song Yuqiao. She stared at Yin Kong as if she was facing a formidable enemy, like a vigilant female leopard, ready to pounce at any time. Yan Fong said coldly, "Senior, as the founder of the Zhengyi school, don't you think it's dirty and shameless to use such despicable means?" Yin Kong said disapprovingly, "I just want the powerful magical weapon of our Zhengyi school. How can it be dirty and shameless? Why don't you just hand it over obediently? I swear to the old ancestor of the 3 pure ones that I will never hurt you." Yan Fong sneered and said, "Will you let us go? Only a ghost would believe what you said." Yin Kong smiled slightly, raised one hand into a palm, and swore, "Old ancestor of the 3 pure ones, the 63rd generation disciple of the Zhengyi school and the 1st generation disciple of the Shen sect, Yin Kong, swear here that as long as..." Before Yin Kong could finish his words, Yan Fong suddenly shouted, "Xiao Qiao, hurry up. Do it." Yan Fong's voice was already neither a man nor a woman. At this time, she shouted at the top of her lungs, and her voice was so strange that it made people's hair stand on end. Yin Kong subconsciously turned his head and raised his hand to slap Song Yuqiao. But when Yin Kong slapped the air, he saw that Song Yuqiao was staring blankly ahead, motionless. Yin Kong suddenly laughed in his heart and thought to himself, "This little girl has never cultivated at all. How could she hurt me? I'm too nervous." But because of this delay, when he turned his head to look at Yen Fong had already disappeared without a trace. Yin Kong was not angry. He smiled, turned to Song Yuqiao, and said, "Little girl, your master doesn't want you anymore. Come with me. I'll teach you a good kung fu skill. What do you think?" Song Yuqiao seemed to be scared out of her wits. She neither objected nor agreed. Yin Kong touched her hair and chuckled. He pressed his palm on her shoulder, moved, and disappeared in the blink of an eye. After an unknown period of time, Yen Fong's figure slowly appeared in the same place. She had used the goddess Nyan seal to hide herself. She had played the trick of luring the tiger away from the mountain and the cicada shedding its shell. She looked around and walked into the yard with great caution. She lifted a few floor tiles in the yard, revealing a patch of soil. She reached into the soil and touched it. When she reached out again, she found a bronze mirror. Yen Fong smiled. As soon as she stood up, there was a sudden puff. A horsetail whisk suddenly pierced through her chest, followed by a scream. It was Song Yuqiao's scream. The horsetail whisk was like the head of a spear, condensed with powerful zhenqi. In the blink of an eye, it pierced through Yen Fong. Yin Kong laughed proudly. He stood behind Yen Fong, holding the horsetail whisk in one hand and pressing the other on Song Yuqiao's shoulder. He said, "How dare you play such a small trick in front of me? Humph, you really don't know." Before he could finish speaking, Yen Fong's body suddenly burned and turned into ashes in the blink of an eye. The smile on Yin Kong's face froze, and a fierce wind came from behind him. Yin Kong was shocked. He didn't even have time to loosen his grip on the horsetail whisk. He suddenly withdrew his palm from Song Yuqiao's body, turned over, and slapped her. Yin Kong seemed to have eyes on the back of his head. His fingers were like iron pincers, clamping a sharp sword. The sharp sword was a paper sword with all kinds of talismans drawn on it. The tip of the sword was sharp and shone with a faint light. It was Yen Fong who was holding the sword. Yen Fong's body was faintly emitting a very faint golden light. Obviously, she was only one step away from the Jinshin phase. She gritted her teeth and trembled all over, trying hard to stab the paper sword into Yin Kong's body. Although the paper sword looked very soft, Yin Kong knew that it was drawn with magic formations and talismans. It was so powerful that it could break the Jinshin once it touched blood. Yin Kong snorted angrily. His fingers that were clamping the sword tightened. He loosened his grip on the horsetail whisk and slowly turned around. His other empty hand slowly stretched out an index finger and pointed at Yen Fong's head. At this time, Yen Fong's whole body was focused on this sword, so she couldn't move. She could only watch Yin Kong's finger getting closer and closer to her. When Yin Kong's finger was only an inch away from Yen Fong's head, he took a deep breath and suddenly exerted force. His finger abruptly thrust forward and pierced into Yen Fong's head. Yin Kong laughed and said, "A little young spirit, how dare you?" But before he could finish his words, he suddenly saw Yen Fong in front of him turn into a pile of ashes and disappear in an instant. Yin Kong was dumbfounded. Just as he reacted, he suddenly felt a pain in his back. In a rage, he backhanded his palm. This palm was so powerful that Yen Fong, who was behind him, suddenly screamed and flew out. She hit the wall and almost collapsed it. Yen Fong's chest was full of blood. At this time, she had been hit by another palm. She was 80% dead. She spat out a mouthful of blood and struggled to stand up. Yin Kong's eyes widened, and he couldn't believe his eyes. He instantly realized that he had stabbed Yen Fong's real body the first time, but she had instantly used an illusion to make him think that he had stabbed a fake body. Then, she had used the fake body to stab him from behind, and her real body had launched a second sneak attack from behind. This kind of trap within a trap within a trap within a trap really shocked Yin Kong. He had been fighting with cultivators of other sects abroad with his Shixiang all year round. He had experienced countless hard and bloody battles, so he had rich experience in fighting. However, most of his opponents were foreigners, and most of them were straightforward. They would kill each other as soon as they met, competing to see who was stronger and whose spiritual power was higher. There was no one like Yen Fong, who had hidden so many schemes and plots in a life-and-death battle. But what Yin Kong had never expected was that Yen Fong had been hiding here for so many days without moving at all. She had even used her own body as a bait to break Yin Kong's golden body in a trap within a trap within a trap. In fact, she had been waiting for the last trump card. Yen Fong wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth and let out a heart-wrenching cry. "Xiao Qiao! Hurry up and do it!" Yin Kong had been fooled once, and he was unwilling to be fooled a second time. He gritted his teeth and pressed toward Yen Fong, saying angrily, "Even if you shout for help, no one can save you." But at this time, Song Yuqiao's body trembled. The scene of Yen Fong saving his life and taking him in as a disciple suddenly appeared in his mind. His master had always called him Xiao Qiao, saying that she liked the name Xiao Qiao. She was the only one in the world who called him that. Although Yen Fong had not taught Song Yuqiao, they were master and disciple, and she had saved his life. Song Yuqiao had felt guilty for abandoning Yen Fong before. At this time, when he heard Yen Fong's cry, he was suddenly enlightened. Suddenly, as if he had been enlightened, he took out the 2 talismans hidden in his sleeve and stuck them on Yin Kong's arm. Yin Kong was completely defenseless against Song Yuqiao. He was stunned and subconsciously looked at the 2 talismans on his arm. His face suddenly changed and he let out a fierce roar. "You!" Before he could finish his words, a bolt of heavenly lightning struck down from the sky and struck him squarely. At the same time, his arm also exploded with a loud bang, forcefully blowing his arm into pieces. Uneasy face. Chapter 972. If a fight was about scheming, and scheming, rather than profound spiritual energy and vigorous zhenqi, Yen Fong could at least be ranked in the top 3 in the world. She was originally a proud and arrogant woman that regarded all men in the world as nothing, and she only favored Wang Yuanshan. But in the end, fate had turned her into a sinister schemer that hid in a dark corner all day long, and she was constantly on guard against schemes and plotting against others at all times. Yen Fong was not only strong-minded, but also alert, smart, quick-witted, and resourceful. In terms of cultivation talent, she was definitely not below Wang Yuanshan. Unfortunately, because of love, she had finally given up her body furnace and lurked in the Fox Zen school to carry out a subversive plan. In the end, her cultivation had greatly regressed. Although her cultivation had fallen greatly and was far from Yin Kong of the Shentian sect, who had made great progress in cultivation in a foreign country, it did not mean that her vision and knowledge were inferior to Yin Kong's. When Yen Fong first saw Yin Kong appear in front of her, she knew that she had been targeted by a Jinshin master of the Shentian sect. It would be difficult for her to get away with it. When a young spirit master met a Jinshin master, it was like seeing a natural enemy. Almost no young spirit master would take the initiative to challenge a Jinshin master, because it was courting death. Yin Kong naturally knew this, so he dared to face Yen Fong like this. In the face of absolute power and overwhelming advantage, if it hadn't been for Deng Yu, Deng Jiao, and Li Yundong's sneak attack, no matter how smart Yen Fong was, it would have been impossible for her to come up with a way to deal with Yin Kong in such a short time. Even if she had come up with it, there was no way to implement it. But she had escaped, and Yin Kong had also underestimated Yen Fong's means, giving her enough time to think and make arrangements. Although Yin Kong had done his homework and was ready to return to China, and he had some understanding of the current situation of the Chinese cultivation world, it was absolutely impossible for him to fully understand how terrible Yen Fong, who had been lurking in the Fox Zen school for 9 years, had become. Even if he knew, he relied on the insurmountable barrier of Jinshin and Yang spirit, but he did not take Yen Fong seriously at all. Yen Fong also knew that there were many flaws in her arrangements and traps, but how could there be an absolutely perfect arrangement in the world? How could there be a trap that she was absolutely sure of? Being able to do this in a hurry was already her limit. She was sure that if she escaped, Yin Kong would definitely use some method to keep an eye on her and then use her to find the Rui universe mirror. Therefore, she obediently went to the place where the mirror of heaven and earth was hidden. She also deliberately waited there for a long time until Song Yuqiao returned. Yen Fong knew that Yin Kong wouldn't take Song Yuqiao seriously, nor would he guard against her. Her life or death depended entirely on whether this apprentice could save her at a critical moment. It turned out that Yin Kong had underestimated his opponent. Yen Fong had won the bet. The consequence of underestimating the enemy was that Yin Kong's golden body was broken, and one of his arms was blown to pieces. Song Yuqiao had a total of 2 talismans in her hands. One was the 5 Thunder Righteous Talisman, and the other was the 9 Sun Flaming Explosion Talisman. They could burst out extremely terrifying lethality in a very small space. Song Yuqiao had heard her master talk about how to use these 2 talismans, and she had also heard about their power. But after all, she hadn't seen or experienced it with her own eyes. Therefore, when she stuck the 2 talismans on Yin Kong's arms, she only took 2 steps back and didn't run away in time. When the heavenly thunder fell, although it didn't hit her, when the 9 Sun Flaming Explosion Talisman exploded, she was sent flying by the powerful shock wave. She hit the wall hard and fell into the chicken pen in the yard. She passed out without saying a word. Yan Fong was also seriously injured at this time. Her chest and lungs were pierced, and blood was flowing wildly. She had only 2 choices at this time. One was to immediately abandon this body tripod and find another one. The other was to immediately treat it. Otherwise, she would definitely die. Compared to Yan Fong, Yin Kong's injuries were more serious. At the beginning, his golden body was broken by Yan Fong's talisman paper sword, and Yan Fong's unique Yin and Yang aura instantly poured into his body. If he had not been struck by the heavenly thunder talisman, he would have been able to expel or even devour the strange aura that had invaded his body in an instant. However, he had been struck by the heavenly thunder talisman. Not only had his arm been blown to smithereens, but his body had also suffered severe injuries. In an instant, Yin Kong's combat power was sharply reduced. He stumbled on the spot, and barely supported himself to not fall down. His eyes widened, and he looked at Yan Fong with extreme shock and anger. He couldn't believe that all this was true. Yan Fong stared at Yin Kong without showing any weakness. She knew that as long as she showed a little bit of weakness, Yin Kong would immediately pounce on her and kill her. At this time, she had no strength to resist. Even a 3-year-old child could stab her to death with a knife. The 2 of them were like 2 ferocious beasts in the forest, fighting to the death. Their stomachs were cut open, but they still refused to give in to each other. Whoever gave in first would die first. Yan Fong glared at Yin Kong fiercely. She bet that Yin Kong would underestimate his opponent, and also bet that he would lose his mind and courage to fight when he suddenly suffered such a serious blow when he had an absolute advantage and the chance of winning. He would immediately run away. However, Yan Fong won the bet at the beginning, and then, she lost the bet. Yin Kong stared at Yan Fong for a long time, then suddenly raised his head and laughed wildly. There was an indescribable anger in his laughter. At this time, he was in the same situation as Yan Fong. He only had 2 choices: immediately treat him, or immediately escape with his Yang spirit. But his golden body had already been broken. If his Yang spirit escaped, by the time he found a suitable body furnace, his Jinshan realm would have already regressed to Yang spirit, and his cultivation would definitely be greatly reduced. Yan Fong was also betting that Yin Kong was unwilling to give up his cultivation, and would turn around to seek treatment. However, Yin Kong had been fighting with foreign sects and forces abroad for many years. Although he was not as scheming and resourceful as Yan Fong, his mind and decisiveness had long been tempered into steel. He made a prompt decision and immediately released his Yang spirit, and his body fell into a pool of blood. Yin Kong grinned grimly at Yan Fong and said, "Good move. Yin Kong's return to China this time has really broadened my horizons." Yin Kong pointed at Yan Fong and said with an angry smile, "Well, Yan Fong, I really underestimated you. I'm afraid you are the first person in history to achieve such a result after the Yang spirit attacked the golden body. Today you must die in peace." Yin Kong raised his hands, waved one hand toward the mirror of heaven and earth, and pointed the other hand at Yan Fong. He said sternly, "Die." Yan Fong sighed in her heart, and the fierce look in her eyes suddenly disappeared. She sighed slowly and closed her eyes in despair. But just as the mirror of heaven and earth was summoned in the air and flew toward Yin Kong, a green light suddenly flashed in the sky and hit the mirror with a clang, sending it flying. This sudden change shocked Yin Kong. He suddenly turned his head in the direction of the green light and asked sternly, "Who is it?" But there was no one around, and no one answered him. The ancient alley of Dongwu City was originally remote, and few people came here except for the local residents. It was surrounded by high walls and deep courtyards. It was not a problem to hide an army, let alone a cultivator. Yin Kong turned out to be a Jinshin master. If he had been attacked, he would not have been afraid. But at this time, his cultivation had been greatly reduced, and he was no longer a Jinshin. How could he still dare to be brave? He was naturally not afraid of Yen Fong alone, but if she had reinforcements, then Yin Kong would really be afraid. Especially when he thought of the master he had met in Mount Longhu, who could shoot a gust of wind with a flick of his finger, which was as powerful as a gun or a cannon. This was really frightening. Yin Kong glanced at Yen Fong. He could kill her with a finger. Then he looked at the mirror of heaven and earth on the ground. He could grab the supreme magic treasure with a wave of his hand. But at this time, he did not dare to move. He just stared at the mirror of heaven and earth with hatred for a while. Suddenly, with a shrill cry, his body suddenly turned into countless green lights and fled in all directions. Yin Kong made a prompt decision. He knew that if he continued to be greedy, his body and soul would be destroyed here, so he did not hesitate to escape without a trace. When Yen Fong heard the sound of the green light breaking through the air, she opened her eyes and saw the hope of survival again. She stared at Yin Kong running away and could not help but feel ecstatic. She struggled to walk toward the mirror of heaven and earth. But she was very seriously injured. She had only taken 2 steps when blood gushed out. She spat out a mouthful of blood and fell to the ground with a thud. She remained motionless and passed out. For a moment, in this small courtyard in the ancient city, 2 people were lying in a pool of blood. One was unconscious. The famous supreme magic treasure for cultivation, the mirror of heaven and earth, lay quietly on the ground. The street outside was empty. No one knew that a soul-stirring battle had just taken place here, except for one person. Zhang Tianxue stood on the roof and looked down at the tragic courtyard. He sighed in his heart. Although Yen Fong was extremely talented and could be said to be amazing, he could see that she was narrow-minded, stubborn, and easily went to extremes. So he did not think highly of her. Now it seemed that he was right. A well-known figure in the cultivation world had ended up like this. Zhang Tianxue could not help but shake his head. His gaze once again landed on the ruby mirror of heaven and earth, and he smiled slightly. Just as he was about to wave his hand to take the Dharma treasure from the air, he suddenly saw a few figures running over from a distant alley. These were the local youths. 3 of them were chasing closely behind them, cursing and swearing, calling him a despicable bastard. The other youth was running like a wolf and a mouse. Although he was in a sorry state, he did not want to be outdone. He kept turning his head and cursing back. His voice was loud and his mouth was full of filthy words. He was also cursing like a bastard and a pervert. When Celestial Master Zhang saw the young man who was being chased and beaten, he suddenly exclaimed in surprise and quickly counted with his fingers. Many people saw Taoist priests or fortune-tellers counting people's lives with their fingers and felt that this behavior was very unreliable. But in fact, it was just a way to calculate the heavenly stems and earthly branches. In the Book of Changes, the cooperation between the 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches generally required pen and paper to calculate. However, the ancients did not have the opportunity to use pen and paper when calculating numerology. At this time, the ancients discovered that the human finger was divided into 3 segments, and the index of the hand was exactly 10 fingers, which corresponded to the fixed 10 heavenly stems and the 12 earthly branches. When matched with the 12 earthly branches, one needed to count the earthly branches according to the knuckles. In this way, one could quickly calculate the heavenly stems and earthly branches of the year and month of the year. It could be seen that counting with fingers was actually the highest level of prediction in the Book of Changes. It was the algorithm of the Qimen Duanjia. The ancients calculated the heavenly stems, earthly branches, 8 trigrams, 8 gates, 9 palaces, 9 stars, 9 gods, and other information in the Qimen Duanjia according to the time of the divination or the time of the incident. With a silent calculation in their hearts, the fate of the world was in the palm of their hands. However, this knowledge was too profound. Not everyone could learn it, and not everyone could calculate with 100% accuracy. However, as the leader of the Xueqi school, Zhang Tianxue had been practicing qi deviation and knew that it was impossible for him to reach the golden immortal realm, so he specialized in the Book of Changes, the Qimen Duanjia, and other supernatural techniques. He was originally good at these 2 kinds of magic. After many years of concentrating on studying them, his cultivation quotient was really superb. Although he could not calculate all the mechanisms with his fingers, he could calculate 70 to 80% of them. Zhang Tianxue pinched his fingers for a while. Suddenly, his expression changed. He raised his head and looked at the young man in disbelief. He couldn't help but laugh out loud. He clapped his hands and said, The calamity of the Black Fox and Wisdom King have been solved. The calamity of the demons will fall on this young man. I can go with peace of mind. Zhang Tianxia laughed, turned around, and left. He did not look at the Inkuan Rui mirror in the courtyard. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared without a trace. Only these few youths were getting closer and closer. Chapter 973. Early in the morning, before the pedestrian street of Tiannan City became lively, Feng Na arrived at Desangxian. Although the store had not been officially allowed to open, the other employees had dispersed. Some went home, some went back to school, and some went to Mount Longhu with Li Yundong to make a scene. Nuashu provides free e-book downloads of this book. She was different from the others. Cheng was able to extricate herself from her love for Li Yundong, and the other students were able to look up to Li Yundong with pure admiration and admiration. Cheng was able to extricate herself from her love for Li Yundong. But she couldn't. From the first time she saw Li Yundong at school like a silly young man, she knew that her fate was entangled with this young man. Maybe she would not become an inseparable part of his life, but like now, staying quietly on the side and working hard to do a good job in the industry he had given her, she felt very happy and satisfied. However, Feng Na felt ashamed to face Li Yundong. Li Yundong had handed over Desangxian to him, but in the end, he had been forced to close the door and reorganize by young Master Lu, who had suddenly appeared. And it had been closed for nearly a month. Feng Na came to the door of Desangxian, opened the copper lock on the door, and pushed the door open alone. The hollowed and carved door was on the left and right sides. It was painted with brown-black paint and carved with the classical images of China immortals. It was antique. As soon as Feng Na pushed the door open, she saw that the tea house was empty. The tea set on the tea table was placed as usual. It was quiet upstairs and downstairs, without the bustling scene of the past. Although Desangxian had opened a branch, people with status still liked to chase after this old shop on the pedestrian street of Tiannan City. Therefore, in the past, before the shop opened, the luxury cars of high-ranking officials, nobles, and rich businessmen and celebrities were all parked in the nearby parking lot. As soon as the shop opened, it would immediately be overcrowded. Normally, although this tea house was not bustling with noise and clamor, it was full of distinguished guests, and the scene of people toppling over the building did give people a feeling of blooming flowers blooming like a brocade, and the entrance was as crowded as a marketplace. At this moment, the shop was deserted. There was not a single shadow of a person in the shop. Only the tea table was covered with a thin layer of dust. It seemed deserted and lonely. Feng Na sighed and looked back, only to see that the tea house of Zhao across the street had been torn down to pieces. A shed frame had been set up outside, and renovation workers were already busy at the door, clanking and clanking. When Desangxian first opened, they had seen the ups and downs of Zhao's tea house in just 1 or 2 hours. But Feng Na did not expect that she would experience such a process. For the first time, it was easy for people to adapt to changes in the environment when they were in a flourishing state, but not everyone could withstand the sudden fall from a high place. But Feng Na was a patient girl. When everyone left the 3 immortals, she came to the 3 immortals on time every day and silently guarded the tea house. Every day, she would carefully clean everything in the tea house, from the tea table to the tea set, from the cobwebs on the roof to the dust on the ground. She cleaned everything until it was spotless. Feng Na carried a basin of water and wiped the dust on the table. Tiannan City had developed rapidly in recent years. The number of cars and factories had increased rapidly, and the air quality had dropped seriously. After just one night, the table was covered with dust again. She was tall and graceful. She quietly bent down to wipe the table. Although she was doing rough work, under the sunlight outside the door, it reflected a quiet and gentle figure, which was completely different from her usual shrewish personality. Feng Na finished wiping the table, put the rag in the basin to wash, and then picked it up to wring it. But when she was about to bend down, she found that there was a figure in front of her. This figure was standing obliquely beside her. It was very familiar. Feng Na couldn't help looking back and saw a man standing at the door. His back was against the light, and his figure was like a silhouette. The morning sun was very bright. Feng Na glanced over. Although she couldn't see his face clearly, she could clearly see the trace of a smile at the corner of the man's mouth. His bright eyes were looking at her with a gentle gaze. At this time, a clear voice came from outside the door. "Ah, Didn't Desanxian already close? Why is it still open today? The voice was clear and moving. After a while, a girl appeared at the door and looked into the shop. Her lips were red, her teeth were white, and her eyes were bright. There was a myriad of charm in her eyes. It was Su-chan. Feng Na stared blankly at Li Yundong and Su-chan at the door, forgetting to say hello for a moment. Li Yundong had mobilized the students of Tiannan University to make trouble at Mount Longhu. Su-chan had wanted to go with them, but Li Yundong had forbidden her to go. Now that the storm of Black Fox had just subsided, as an extremely sensitive person, it was really not suitable for Su-chan to show her face in a place like Mount Longhu. Therefore, after being persuaded by Li Yundong, the little girl obediently chose to stay at home in Tiannan City. However, when Li Yundong returned from Mount Longhu and began to turn around to clean up the backyard that was on fire, Su-chan couldn't stay any longer. She insisted on coming with Li Yundong no matter what. After staying at home for a while, the little girl gradually recovered from the turmoil and sorrow. Although she had matured a lot, and was no longer as lively as a little girl in the past, it was difficult to change her nature. Wherever she went, she revealed a youthful, lovely vitality and tenderness. The silent tea house was originally as quiet as a black and white ink painting, but as soon as the little girl came, the picture immediately had color, vivid and bright. Su-chan noticed that Feng Na was staring at Li Yundong in a daze. Her eyes darted around, and she shrank back obediently. Then, she poked Li Yundong in the waist with a finger and winked at him. She winked and winked at him. Li Yundong nodded with a smile, stepped forward, and said to Feng Na with a smile, "Feng Na, these days, you've worked hard. You've suffered." When Feng Na heard this, her heart suddenly softened, and tears almost burst out of her eyes. She turned around and quickly wiped the tears from the corners of her eyes with her hand. When she turned back again, her face was full of smiles. "No, I've had a long vacation these days. Is this a paid vacation?" Li Yundong knew that Feng Na cared about her face, so he pretended to be relaxed, but in fact, he didn't know how many times he had cried behind her back and how much pressure he had endured. He reached out and patted Feng Na on the shoulder, sat down, and said, "It's okay. I'm back. Don't be afraid. Tell me in detail." Feng Na looked at Li Yundong with a smile that was filled with warmth and strength. It was as if there was nothing in the world that Li Yundong couldn't solve as long as he was by her side. After Feng Na sat down and told Li Yundong what had happened, she looked at him with concern and asked, "The other party seems to have a very powerful background. Do you want to ask Xueqi or Mr. Shen for help?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "It's just a clown. There's no need for the two of them to come forward." Feng Na looked at Li Yundong with some doubt. She knew that Li Yundong was definitely not an ordinary person, but this kind of worldly dispute, if he didn't use the power of the government to settle it, would it? Li Yundong nodded to Feng Na with a smile and said, "Call the others first and ask them to come back and get ready to work. After so many days of rest, it's time to get some exercise. If our shop continues to be idle, I'm afraid that worms will grow." Feng Na pursed her lips and smiled. Seeing that Li Yundong was firm, she felt relieved. She nodded hard and said, "Okay, I'll contact them now. What about you? What are you going to do next?" Li Yundong smiled and said, "Of course, I'm going to settle accounts with some people. They will spit out what they have eaten from me sooner or later." Feng Na blinked her eyes and said, "Are you talking about Mr. Liu? His background is very strong. Take it easy." Li Yundong laughed and said, "I know. Don't worry." When Feng Na saw Li Yundong sitting at the tea table, she suddenly came to her senses. She stood up and said, "Look at me, I forgot to make tea for you." She turned her head to look upstairs and said, "There have been a few new teas recently, and they taste very good." "Yoop." Feng Na turned her head again, only to see that Li Yundong had disappeared. Even Su-chan, who was at the door, had disappeared, as if she had never been there. Feng Na was stunned on the spot. After a while, she sighed and sat down. Her pretty face was filled with a sense of loss. Li Yundong and Su-chan left Desanxian. Su-chan took Li Yundong's arm and asked with a smile, "Yundong, do you know where Mr. Liu lives?" Li Yundong shook his head with a smile. "I don't know." As he spoke, he closed his eyes, and the Jinshin Yang spirit in his body instantly came out from under his feet. In the blink of an eye, it turned into countless doppelgangers and spread out in all directions. Li Yundong closed his eyes for a short while, then opened them again and said to Su Chan with a smile, "Now I know." At this time, Su Chan's cultivation still had the spiritual power and Xueqi of the mystical silver fox. Her cultivation was terrifyingly high, but compared with the mystical silver fox, she lacked the rich fighting experience and superb talent of the mystical silver fox, which had accumulated for thousands of years. Therefore, she didn't expect that Li Yundong would be able to find the existence of the other party through her method of the unity of heaven and man. Su Chan looked at Li Yundong with admiration and said, "Are you going to find him now?" Li Yundong laughed and said, "I've already found him." Su Chan was shocked and widened her eyes. "Weren't you here just now?" "Ah, did you find him through the Yang spirit doppelganger?" "What did you say?" "What did he say?" Li Yundong smiled slightly and said mysteriously, "I taught him a little lesson." Su Chan chuckled gloatingly and said, "Yes." Baidu entered Nuashu.net to read the full text online for free. I recommend a beautiful new work, Dog God, which is updated steadily and of good quality. Friends who are in a shortage of books can have a look. Haha. Welcome to subscribe. Chapter 974. Early in the morning, when the sun shone into the room through the gap in the curtains, eldest young Master Lu was still sleeping soundly. A girl was sleeping next to him. Her long black hair spread in front of her like a waterfall, and her face could not be seen clearly. Only her breasts were as pink as snow, and her cleavage was amazing. Book Bar 1. In recent years, the economy of Tiannan City had developed rapidly. 4-star hotels and above had sprung up like bamboo shoots after a rain, and there were also many 5-star hotels. The beauty sleeping next to eldest young Master Lu was the prey he had picked up in the nightclub yesterday. In order to please the girl, eldest young Master Lu had spent thousands of yuan to rent a presidential suite. The clothes of the two people were scattered all over the room, and there were traces of battle everywhere. When the sun shone on eldest young Master Lu's eyes, he opened them in a daze and subconsciously turned his head to take a look. Seeing that the beauty next to him was still sleeping soundly, eldest young Master Lu laughed and slid his hand under the quilt to eat. Although he had fallen in love with Feng Na, a beautiful and self-reliant girl a few days ago, and had caused Sanxian to close down for rectification, he did not stop there. A man like him, who could not live without women, naturally had a lot of women around him. Eldest young Master Lu lifted the girl's hair and revealed a beautiful face. The shape and appearance of her face were very similar to Feng Na's, but there was a lot more wind and dust. Even after a night's sleep, there was still a thick layer of makeup and thick eyeliner on her face, unlike Feng Na, who had a pure beauty like a lotus flower in clear water and a natural carving. For men, especially for eldest young Master Lu, who could attract many beautiful women with a crook of his finger, such a girl had a fatal attraction to him. What could not be got was the best. This truth was universal throughout the ages. Eldest young Master Lu could not help thinking of the round-faced girl again. He could not help feeling a little annoyed and withdrew his hand under the quilt. He did not expect that Feng Na would be so strong and stubborn that she would not give in even when she was suppressed like this. Moreover, what surprised the eldest young Master Lu the most was that he had been looking for trouble with the Sanxian, but they had never responded. This was the most unexpected thing for him. In his opinion, no matter how weak his opponent was, he would at least be angry or protest. If it was a stronger opponent, he might even directly counterattack like a thunderstorm. However, his combination of punches seemed to have hit cotton, and there was no movement at all. It was as if a person had roared at the heavens for a while, but the heavens remained silent and gloomy. This made eldest young Master Lu very uneasy. Such a silent opponent was the most difficult to deal with, because the eldest young Master Lu could not figure out the opponent's details and thoughts at all. The reason why the sea was awe-inspiring was that it remained calm even when a storm was about to come. The reason why the sky was awe-inspiring was that it remained silent even when a storm was about to come. The eldest young Master Lu had grown up in a family of officials, and his sense of danger was far superior to that of ordinary people. He faintly felt that a kind of danger was coming to him. Did he find the wrong person to fight with such an opponent? Because he knew that the target he chose was definitely not an ordinary person. If an ordinary person was tormented by him like this and became silent, then it was because they were afraid of his power. Who knows, he might pounce on them and bite them again. But who was the target he chose? The opening of a tea house could alarm the #1 figure of the provincial party committee. If such a person knew that he had been offended, How could he not do anything? In the eyes of the eldest young Master Lu, this was absolutely unimaginable. Tai Chi Master Li Yashuan once held a banquet. A stranger came up to shake hands with her because of her fame. Li Yashuan shook hands politely, but she did not expect that the other party had malice. At the moment of shaking hands, his fingers forcefully broke Li Yashuan's thumb. If it had been another person who made such a sneak attack, he would have been furious on the spot, and the banquet would have become a place of blood. But Li Yashuan acted as if nothing had happened. She sat down as usual, said nothing during the banquet, and ate as usual. The person who made the sneak attack was terrified. The longer he stayed, the more frightened he became. When the banquet was over, the more he went back and thought about it, the more frightened he became. Finally, he could not bear the torture and went to apologize in person. But if the person he had attacked was a nameless pawn, he would not have been so panicked and restless, and would not have been sleepless all night. But who was Li Yashuan? Li Yashuan was the outstanding disciple of Taiji guru Yang Chengfu. In his later years, Yang Chengfu was famous. Countless masters came to challenge him, but Li Yashuan was the one who defeated them all. And Yang Chengfu was the great-grandson of Yang Luchen, who was once invincible in Beijing. People gave him the nickname Invincible Yang. When he was young, he loved to play. Before his father Yang Jianho died, he said to him with tears, "Your elder brother followed uncle to practice martial arts day and night, very hard, but you enjoy life and play. Now you are teaching disciples. If one day a master came to challenge you and you lost, how could you live up to the reputation of your ancestor Yang Wudi?" Yang Chengfu was shocked. At the age of 34, he practiced martial arts hard. 6 years later, he succeeded and left the mountain. In 1923, he openly accepted disciples in Beijing. At this time, there were many masters in Beijing. Hearing that Invincible Yang's great-grandson was accepting disciples, the world was shocked. Countless masters gathered in Beijing to challenge Yang Chengfu. Yang Chengfu did not refuse anyone who came to challenge him. He had defeated countless people, and among them, there were only 2 who had come to challenge him and ended in a draw. One was the armed saint Zhang Su, who practiced the penetrating fist, and the other was the world-renowned martial saint Sun Lutong, who was known to be invincible in the world. After the competition between Yang Chengfu, Zhang Su and Sun Lutong, the 3 of them became sworn brothers. It could be seen that his martial arts were excellent and had reached the peak. As his disciple, Li Yashuan's position in Kung Fu was the same as Zhou Qin's. There was no doubt about her Kung Fu. A great master like him was offended like this. If he retaliated later, the consequences would be terrible, which was really unimaginable. Since ancient times, one could be a thief for 1,000 days, but there was no such thing as guarding against thieves for 1,000 days. It was also for this reason that the attacker could not bear such terrible suffering and torture, so he took the initiative to apologize and ask for forgiveness. Eldest young Master Lu was now very much like the martial arts master who attacked Li Yashuan. He originally thought that after the sneak attack, he could provoke the other party to fight back in anger, and he would have a way to deal with it no matter what. But the other party did not respond, so all his efforts fell into vain. The more eldest young Master Lu waited, the more flustered and uneasy he became. But now he was in a difficult position. If he took the initiative to let de Sanxian go, he would become a laughingstock in the circle in the future. This was something that the young and vigorous eldest young Master Lu could not accept. But if he continued to wait like this, when would it end? The more eldest young Master Lu thought about it, the more upset he became. He reached out to touch the cigarette on the table, but when his hand was halfway there, suddenly there was a person in front of him, standing in front of the bed and looking at him. The man stood by the windowsill. He was not very tall, but he gave people a kind of majesty that could not be looked at directly. He was against the light, and the sun shone on him, revealing a faint golden light, like a god or a Buddha. Eldest young Master Lu did not see anyone in front of him a second ago, but in the next second, there was one more person out of thin air. This was not a trivial matter. The eldest young Master Lu was so shocked that all the pores on his body exploded, and all the hair on his body stood up. All men had morning erections in the morning, and eldest young Master Lu was no exception. When he woke up, he was like a pillar holding up the sky. But at this moment, he was frightened, and the iron pillar fell down in an instant. The middle of his crotch was wet and hot in an instant. It was shameful and smelly, and he immediately urinated and defecated. Traditional Chinese medicine said that fear would hurt the kidney and shock would hurt the gallbladder. It was because at the moment of fear, all the blood in the body would gather to the middle dantian of the heart in an instant. At this time the heart would beat faster, and the load on the heart would suddenly increase by several times or even more than 10 times, causing the pressure on the heart to suddenly increase. When some people were extremely shocked, their hands and feet were cold because the blood in their limbs had been drawn to the heart, causing their hands and feet to be cold. Some people were scared to death, because their hearts could not bear the rapid blood flow and the instantaneous expansion of the ventricles and atriums, leading to death. When people were frightened, they would urinate and defecate because, according to the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, the kidney was the second bowel. In the chapter of the Yellow Emperor's canon of internal medicine, Plain Questions, it was also said that fear leads to the lowering of qi. The kidney was the source of vitality, and the function of the kidney was to consolidate. Some people's essence, qi and spirit were extremely strong, and their qi was restrained and full of vitality. This was because their kidney qi was sufficient, and their qi was restrained and consolidated. But once the kidney qi was not solid, the qi would sink, and the kidney's consolidation function would be reduced. Once the consolidation function was reduced, it would lead to urinary incontinence. At this time, eldest young Master Lu was so frightened that he did not notice that he had urinated. He just looked at the man who had suddenly appeared in front of him in horror and fear, shivering all over. This man was naturally Li Yundong's young spirit doppelganger. He stood at the head of eldest young Master Lu's bed and stared at him faintly. Although his eyes were not sharp, they were like Buddha in the clouds looking down at ants on the ground. The pressure was so strong that it was suffocating. Li Yundong had originally wanted to teach this guy who had dared to offend him a lesson, but when he appeared, he was so scared that he had urinated and defecated. Moreover, judging from the lack of qi between his eyebrows, it was a question whether he could still stand up normally like a man in the future. He immediately lost interest in teaching a bug lying in the filth. Li Yundong stared at eldest young Master Lu and only said lightly, "You closed the door of Desanxian, didn't you?" This sentence was like a heavy iron hammer, smashing on eldest young Master Lu's heart. It startled him so much that a crazy voice was screaming in the depths of his mind. "Here it comes! Here it comes indeed! I'm going to die! I'm going to die!" At this time, eldest young Master Lu had no time to think about who the other party was and what kind of shuntong he had that could appear in front of him in an instant. At this time, all his wits had completely degenerated, leaving only the instinct of a weak animal to tremble in fear of a powerful creature. At this time, eldest young Master Lu thought that he was going to die. Since the other party could appear in his room without anyone noticing, he naturally had the means to kill him without anyone noticing. This kind of fear of death deeply enveloped eldest young Master Lu's body and soul, making him lose almost all his functions. He couldn't move, shout, breathe, or even move his eyeballs even if he wanted to. However, Li Yundong just took a deep look at him, and a slight smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It was hard to tell whether it was mockery, contempt, or something else, but his smile was deeply imprinted in the mind of the eldest young Master Lu like a brand, making him receive a clear message in an instant. "You are just a low-level creature. I can kill you as easily as pinching a bug to death." At this moment, eldest young Master Lu suddenly regained control of his body. He found that he could move again. He shivered all over and was about to beg for mercy, but he suddenly found that Li Yundong was no longer in front of him. He had disappeared, as if he had never been there. Eldest young Master Lu was covered in cold sweat on the bed, unable to come to his senses for a long time. The beauty beside him was still unconscious. Only his thighs and the bed were dirty, and the stench was strong. Chapter 975. Li Yunyang was shocked by the bedside of Donggu Sang. Young Master Lu went to visit Desanxian that day and took the initiative to beg Feng Na for mercy and admit his mistake. The next day, Desanxian reopened for business. Soon, Carrot, please remember our website. After such a disturbance, if it had been another shop or enterprise, it would have been able to kill the shop or enterprise in nearly a month. But Desanxian was different. If Desanxian was an ordinary tea house, it had created a wave of cultural craze, but it had been cut off for nearly a month. For a new industry, it was 80% likely to collapse. Even if it did not collapse, it would suffer a fatal blow, and it was very likely that it would not be able to recover. However, Desanxian did not rely on popularity and customer volume to operate. What could really support this industry was actually the group of people in Desanxian who were qualified to get Earth Immortal cards or Celestial Immortal cards. Although the number of human immortal cards was far more than that of Earth Immortal cards and Celestial Immortal cards, and at the same time, it also brought great popularity to Desanxian. However, in fact, they were the most cultured and passionate ones. They were also the most capricious ones. Unlike the group of people who had Earth Immortal cards or Celestial Immortal cards, what they drank was the real immortal tea of Desanxian. What they drank was just tea with a little immortal qi. Although it had the effect of nourishing the body and calming the mind, it was not enough to bring them some kind of great physical or psychological change. Even if some people did, after nearly a month, it was enough to make them forget about Desanxian. The faster a thing rose, if it suddenly encountered setbacks and blows, the faster it would decline. It was the same in ancient times and modern times. The Desanxian had been closed for nearly a month. At first, a large number of elegant guests kept asking about when the Desanxian would open. But slowly, their enthusiasm faded, and they gradually forgot about the tea house, which had once been a mess. Although some high-ranking officials and nobles with Earth Immortal cards and Celestial Immortal cards had the ability and energy to settle these things, the water in China's officialdom was too deep. You almost there, Chan Wan Kai, who could help Desanxian the most, went abroad to negotiate, while Zhou Qin's old man was far away in another province. Even if he knew about this matter, he would not easily intervene. Although eldest young Master Lu's strength was as small as an ant to him, his father stood behind him. Although his father's official position was far lower than Zhou Keqiang's, eldest young Master Lu's father would certainly have someone above him. The officialdom of China was complicated. Sometimes, the power of a small county party secretary could even affect the central government. This was the complicated officialdom of China. When many people learned that Desanxian had offended a certain child and closed the shop, they became vigilant and watched from a distance. It was impossible for them to fall into an unpredictable realm for the sake of a cup of tea. Chinese people were often like this. Their talent for seeking benefits and avoiding harm was far superior to other races in the world. As soon as they heard that Desanxian had offended someone, they hid far away and waited to see what would happen. When they saw that Desanxian had reopened, they came out again with great enthusiasm. However, compared with those ordinary tea guests who would forget about it after a while, this group of people were still hardcore. The reason was very simple, because what they drank was the immortal tea that could really improve one's physique and health. The so-called tasting the marrow referred to this group of people. Usually, they were used to drinking the tea of Desanxian, and they didn't feel anything during the spring breeze and drizzle. But when they stopped, their lives were still extravagant, and their health suddenly deteriorated from good to bad. The contrast was immediately very obvious, and this group of people could only wait anxiously. As soon as Desanxian reopened, this group of people immediately spread the news. Within an hour, the entrance of Desanxian was once again blocked by all kinds of high-end cars. Those who used to be very polite to Feng Na had hardly shown up a month ago. When they appeared again at this time, some of them were thick-skinned and didn't mention a word about the past, as if they didn't know that Desanxian had closed for a month. Some of them were thin-skinned and said that they were on a business trip or abroad, so they didn't know that Desanxian was in such a situation. They patted their chests and promised that if such a situation happened again in the future, they would do their best to help. However, Feng Na knew that if these people were reliable, even a pig could climb a tree. In this world, the most reliable person was Li Yundong. In the Desanxian tea house, Feng Na looked at the Desanxian tea house, which had become full of friends again. She felt extremely emotional in her heart. From bustling to deserted, from bustling to lonely, and then from deserted to crowded. It was just one night. The ups and downs of life and the unpredictability of things in the world were all revealed. But what made Feng Na even more emotional was that after Li Yundong had solved the problem at hand, she didn't know where he had gone. It was really hard to see the tail of a dragon. She didn't know when they would meet again. At this time, an unexpected guest came to Li Yundong's house, which surprised him very much. "Mr. Li, please consider my proposal carefully. Please." Tanaka Misa was wearing a beautiful white cherry blossom kimono. She was kneeling in the living room of Li Yundong's house. Her body was deeply bent down, and there was a red pillow tied to the bag on her back. The Japanese kimono had strict requirements. The pillow was used to distinguish whether a woman was married or not. The pillow behind a married woman was a pillow, and the pillow behind an unmarried woman was a bow. The butterfly behind Tanaka Misa matched the kimono on her body very well. The clothes were pink cherry blossoms on a white background, and the bow on the pillow was white cherry blossoms on a pink background. It looked graceful, dignified, and elegant. The little foxes of the Fox Zen school looked at the Japanese girl in front of them curiously. Although they had seen Tachibana Wakako in a kimono before, she was too young to wear the real beauty of the kimono. Tanaka Misa, on the other hand, was an old leftover woman in the upper class of Japan. She had a graceful figure and a beautiful appearance. Wearing this kimono, she looked gorgeous, quiet, and dignified. Li Yundong sat cross-legged on the floor and looked at Tanaka Misa thoughtfully. He hadn't expected that at this time, a Japanese conglomerate would take the initiative to cooperate with him and discuss the matter of driving the Desanxian to Japan. It wasn't that he hadn't thought about this before, but after the incident with the mystical silver fox, Li Yundong had given up this idea. First, he hadn't dealt with the domestic affairs well, so he had no time to care about them for the time being. Second, there had been a fierce battle between gods and Buddhas on Mount Tianlong. Countless people in the Japanese cultivation world had died or been injured, and almost all of them had been directly or indirectly related to him. If he hadn't insisted on protecting Su Chan, he was afraid that the Japanese cultivation world wouldn't have suffered so many casualties. Thinking of this, Li Yundong naturally didn't think that the Japanese cultivation world would buy his account. They didn't come to take revenge on him, which was already their greatest patience. At the same time, he had given them a great shock. Otherwise, with the national character of the Japanese, once they found that he was stronger than Li Yundong, they would immediately kill him without any hesitation. But at this time, Tanaka Misa had come to Li Yundong on behalf of the Tanaka conglomerate under the Mitsui group. This was thought-provoking. What are these Japanese up to? Li Yundong couldn't help but feel a little confused. Although he was invincible in fighting, when it came to economic things, he was in a different profession. No matter how smart he was, he couldn't figure out what the other party wanted to do. Although he was considered to have a certain background in China and no one would make life difficult for him, it was a different story once he left the country. In the past, he could still rely on his reputation as the reincarnated Wisdom King to gain popularity in Japan and enjoy some incense money. However, since the Japanese cultivation groups had come to China several times and returned bleeding several times, especially after the tragic battle at the foot of Mount Tianlong, the Japanese cultivation world had suffered indescribable damage. After returning to China, almost every family was holding a funeral, and all the sects were holding funerals. The entire Japanese cultivation world was crying loudly, and mourning was everywhere. The Japanese should want to tear him to pieces. In such a situation, if he still opened the shop in Japan, if it wasn't asking for trouble and seeking his own death, then what was it? However, if he completely gave up this matter, Li Yundong felt that it was a pity for the Japanese market. After all, although the tea ceremony originated in China, even Li Yundong, a patriot of the Chinese nation, had to admit that after the tea ceremony went east to Japan, it had been greatly promoted. It could even be said that the tea ceremony was far more popular and valued in Japan than in China. In China, most of the time, tea was just a business, just a commodity under the guise of art. But in Japan, tea was art, culture, and sacred Tao. If he wanted to take root in the world, he had to first conquer the Japanese market. Otherwise, it would be empty talk all over the world. Only by conquering the Japanese market and making the Japanese completely recognize the tea shop of Desanxian would he be successful in the future. It would be much simpler and easier. Therefore, Li Yundong had thought that it was hopeless to enter Japan, but Tanaka Misa's sudden return made him feel hopeful. Business was far more complicated than cultivation. Cultivation was a matter of a single person. A single person could rely on their own incomparably powerful strength to turn the tide and hold up the sky single-handedly. However, in business, there had never been a single person who could charge and break through enemy lines to settle everything. Any success in business was definitely a team victory. No matter how powerful Li Yundong was, it was impossible for him to go to Japan alone to kill people and rob tens of billions of yuan. If he did that, he would immediately become the second big devil and be attacked by the world. Even God would not tolerate him. It was a matter of course to abide by the rules of one's profession. Therefore, Li Yundong wanted to bring Desanxian to Japan. This was very likely to be an opportunity, but it was also very likely that the other party wanted to pull him into a completely strange field, a completely strange world, and set up a trap. But, should he avoid this trap, or should he face it head-on, decisively jump into it, and use his great wisdom and strategy to break out of it? Li Yunyang stared at Tanaka Misa, who was crawling in front of him, and fell into deep thought. What are you doing? What are you doing? VBSP. What are you doing? Chapter 975 Looking East to Fusang. Chapter 976. While Li Yundong was in a dilemma, the Japanese cultivation world was also in a deep dilemma. The Battle of Mount Koya made the Japanese cultivation world know a young man from the Chinese cultivation world. The Battle of Nazuno made the Japanese cultivation world realize the horror of Li Yundong as the top master in the Chinese cultivation world, and completely made Li Yundong famous. There were tens of millions of Buddhists in Japan, and many of them believed in the immovable wisdom king. It could be said that there were good believers. This situation was just like when Wu Qingyuan went east to Japan at the age of 14. This genius national player, who was known as the pinnacle of Go, the pinnacle of Tao, became a Japanese citizen in order to compete with the world's top Go players in Japan at that time. He rose to prominence at the time when China and Japan were at loggerheads. Japan was very hostile to this Chinese Go player and did not recognize his Japanese nationality at all. Wu Qingyuan played chess on the tip of the knife all day long. As long as he lost once in 10 battles, he would immediately be smashed to pieces. However, he did not lose. Not only did he not lose, but in the past 20 years, he had defeated all the 7 strongest players in Japan in 10 consecutive battles. Between 1939 and 1956, the Japanese Go world only did a few things: revoke Wu Qingyuan's nationality and disqualify him from participating in the Haninjo Games, the highest level of Go competition in Japan. Then they selected their strongest Go players through various tournaments and sent them to Wu Qingyuan for him to slap to death. Then, they selected a new one for him to slap to death. 20 years later, the Japanese Go world found that this was not a good way. 7 national players were killed in a row in the Go world. They couldn't stand it anymore. No one could stop Wu Qingyuan, so they found a member of the club and knocked him away at the gate of a community. From then on, the Japanese Go world was no longer ravaged by Wu Qingyuan. However, a few years later, especially in the middle and late 1970s, China's Go rose rapidly. Nie Wei-ping, the chess sage, appeared out of nowhere and defeated 6 top Japanese Go players in a row, shattering the Japanese dream of being the best in the world. At this time, the Japanese people's self-esteem was seriously damaged. They found that they had been ahead of the world for decades or even hundreds of years, but they were suddenly overtaken by the Chinese. They wanted to find someone to defeat Nie Wei-ping, but they couldn't find anyone. At this time, they found a good target: Wu Qingyuan. Therefore, they began to recognize everything about Wu Qingyuan, granting him citizenship and various honorary titles. They also boasted shamelessly that the world's #1 chess saint, Wu Qingyuan, was from Japan. They also trumpeted that Wu Qingyuan was the strongest in the world and that Nie Wei-ping was not even worthy of carrying his shoes when compared to him. The clowns of the island countries had been playing this kind of trick for thousands of years. As the reincarnation of the immovable wisdom king, although things were different, the truth was almost exactly the same as that of Wu Qingyuan. When the Japanese found that Masako Tachibana, the strongest in their civil war, could not withstand a single blow from Li Yundong, and when they found that their mystical silver fox with a pale face was finally defeated by Li Yundong, they had already realized that the whole Japanese cultivation world could not stop this powerful and frightening young man. But when they found that Li Yundong was actually the reincarnation of Wisdom King, the Japanese couldn't help but get excited again. It turned out that such a powerful master was also the reincarnation of the Lord God that Japan believed in. What? The immovable Wisdom King is a god from China's Tangmi, not from Japan? Fuck, the people of China almost exterminated Tangmi more than 1,000 years ago. If it weren't for Japan, how could there be a Tangmi faction in the world? Moreover, the people of China don't believe in religion now. In China, the number of people who believe in the immovable Wisdom King is less than 1% of the people of Japan. If the immovable Wisdom King is not the god of Japan, which country is he from? In this way, the Japanese people felt much more comfortable. No wonder His Highness Li Yundong was so powerful. It turned out that he was the reincarnation of the god of our Empire of Japan. It was as if after being beaten up, he hypnotized himself and comforted himself that the one who taught him a lesson was his senior. Japan paid attention to the order of merit and virtue. Losing to a senior was not a shameful thing. It was natural and justified. But the biggest difference between Li Yundong and Wu Qingyuan was that Wu Qingyuan was a genius in chess and an idiot in other aspects. If he didn't play chess, he would be a good-for-nothing. He had no value in the world at all. All the value in his life lay in playing chess. Therefore, after the Japanese recognized all his honors and status, he did not refuse or refute them. He was still not surprised or happy. He still played chess honestly and studied chess skills. But Li Yundong was different. Although he was a great genius in cultivation, he was not like Wu Qingyuan, who was nothing without go. Li Yundong was a sentimental person. At the beginning, he had cultivated for Su Chan and longed to become stronger. Therefore, he could do all kinds of horrible things for Su Chan. Therefore, when the Japanese added Wu Qingyuan's honorary status, Wu Qingyuan accepted it. But when the Japanese wanted to add all kinds of honorary status to Li Yundong, they happened to meet the mystical silver fox possessing Su Chan's body. As a result, the Japanese cultivation world was completely tragic. Because of Li Yundong, this group of Japanese people was severely taught a lesson by the mystical silver fox. When they returned to Japan to hold a funeral, all the sects in the Japanese cultivation world were holding funerals. There was no sect that didn't do funerals at all. Even Ise Shinto, who had suffered the least damage, had no choice but to do something unnecessary due to the pressure. Both Shen Guang and Chu Yun pretended to cry in front of all the gods. However, they pretended to cry, but many sects in the Japanese cultivation world were really crying. Their hatred for Li Yundong exploded in an instant, almost reaching the critical point. The soul of the mystical silver fox had been completely scattered. It was impossible for them to take revenge on the mystical silver fox. Even if they wanted to find trouble, they could only fall on Su Chan's head. But what was the difference between falling on Su Chan's head and falling on Li Yundong's head? The Japanese cultivation world could find out clearly that many of those who had offended Li Yundong were living a good life, but because of Su Chan, they had annoyed Li Yundong. Their bodies and souls had been destroyed and they were no longer in the world. Looking for trouble with Su Chan? F***ck, everyone, calm down. The Japanese cultivation world had a deep hatred for China and anti-Chinese soil. Previously, because of Li Yundong's extremely strong power, they had no choice but to yield. Fortunately, the pro-China party could find such a reason as the reincarnation of Wisdom King to force them to yield. But now, the reincarnation of Wisdom King advocated by the pro-China party had turned around and beaten them up. In the past, they could say that the senior had beaten them up and they could still smile, but this time? They couldn't say that their father had beaten them up, could they? No matter how shameless a person was, he wouldn't be so shameless, would he? Therefore this time, the Japanese could no longer find any reason to flatter Li Yundong. The anti-Chinese party and the anti-Chinese party instantly gained the upper hand. If it weren't for the fact that they had been badly injured and they really felt that they couldn't beat Li Yundong, they would have immediately sent out all their elites and rushed to China to take revenge. At this time, in the Wishing Temple, the headquarters of the Pure Land True sect in the Japanese cultivation world, a young monk was holding an old monk and crying loudly. In the imperial shadow hall with white walls and gray tiles, the young monk looked extremely young. He was only about 15 or 16 years old. He had delicate features and a good foundation. The old monk in front of him was extremely old, and his two snow-white eyebrows almost reached his ears. The young monk hugged the old monk and cried, "Your Highness, why is this happening? Didn't Master say that there was no danger in this trip? Why did he leave me without saying a word?" This old monk was called Xueqi Rain Tea, a leading figure in the Imperial Shadow Hall of the Pure Land True sect. She was one of the 8 yellow-robed monks of the Pure Land True sect. Her cultivation and experience were extremely high. Xueqi Rain Tea patted the young monk on the shoulder and sighed, saying, "Dongming was Su, that's because he mistakenly trusted an untrustworthy person. If it weren't for my special identity, I'm afraid I would have ended up the same as him." The young monk called Dongming was Su raised his head, revealing a face with delicate features, red lips, and white teeth. If it weren't for the fact that his voice was clearly that of a man, he would have looked like a girl. Dongming was Su knew that the old monk in front of him was not an ordinary person. He was one of the members of the Japanese royal family. In the past, the Japanese royal family fought for power and profit. Although the losers were not killed, they often chose to shave their hair and become a monk. There was no surname in the Japanese royal family. Before Iki Rain-T became a monk, she had no surname or name. She only had the title of the royal family. After becoming a monk, everything was empty. Naturally, her previous name had to be changed. Therefore, after Iki Rain-T failed in the struggle, she shaved her hair and became a monk, giving herself such a name. He was born in a noble family and had high talent. After decades of cultivation, he had reached an unpredictable realm. His cultivation was even higher than that of the suzerain of the Pure Land True sect. This time, many masters of the Pure Land True sect followed the suzerain to China. As the leader of the Imperial Shadow Hall, he was supposed to follow them. However, although Iki Rain-T had left the royal family, her previous identity was there. Therefore, his special identity allowed him to escape and he did not follow the main force to China. After the team of the Pure Land True sect returned, nearly half of its members had been reduced, and the body and soul of the suzerain had also been destroyed. Even his body had been put together and brought back. This caused an uproar in the temple. Although the suzerain of the Pure Land True sect had profound spiritual power and was known as a godlike figure in the sect, when he arrived at China, he was vulnerable in front of the mystical silver fox, let alone Li Yunyang, who had defeated all the gods and Buddhas by himself. The Pure Land True sect was shocked and angry, and Iki Rain-T was even more regretful. If she had known this would happen, she would have stopped the suzerain. Higashi Washo was the beloved disciple of the Pure Land True sect's suzerain, Ito Saji. He was considered one of the future leaders of the Japanese cultivation world. Ito Saji had the intention of protecting Higashi Washo, so he did not let him follow him to China. He was afraid that something would happen to him and destroy the future of the Pure Land True sect. However, he did not expect that although his idea had protected Higashi Washo, he had lost himself. Higashi Washo had been a monk since he was a child. When he was 5 years old, he could not speak. When his mother carried him to burn incense and entered the Buddhist temple, she accidentally met Ito Saji preaching. At that time, Higashi Washo pointed to Ito Saji and began to speak. He was talking about Buddhist scriptures, and there were clouds and rosy clouds above his head. When Ito Saji saw this, he was shocked and accepted Higashi Washo as his disciple on the spot. For more than 10 years, he had been teaching him carefully behind closed doors. They had a close relationship and were like father and son. Higashi Washo's eyes were red, and he cried and shouted, "Your Highness, why don't you let me go to China to avenge my master? A teacher for a day is a father for a lifetime. Do I have to swallow the hatred of my father's death?" Unlike the Izumo, Divine Light, and other pro-China sects of the ISE Shinto, Iki Rain-T was an authentic anti-China sect. Although her name was elegant, she was a person who advocated violence. That was why there were so many human weapons in the Imperial Shadow Hall. Iki Rain-T had always disapproved of the pro-China theories of Kaisai Hikaryuni and the others. Her method had always been simple, which was to conquer, and conquer again. Even if she couldn't conquer them now, she would hide carefully and wait for an opportunity to conquer them in the future. Iki Rain-T stared at Higashi Washo, her old face revealing an indescribable murderous intent. She said slowly, "Because you are still too weak, and your opponent is too strong. Please remember your opponent's name. He will accompany you for a lifetime." Higashi Washo's handsome face looked ferocious. "Is it the Devil King called Li Yundong? I must defeat him in the future." Iki Rain-T shook her head slowly and said, "No, your real enemy isn't called Li Yundong." Higashi Washo leaned forward and widened his eyes. He said murderously, "Then what is he called?" Iki Rain-T said word by word, "Zheng. Oki Rain-T." Chapter 977. Eheim Raintia's words shocked Higashi Washo. He asked in confusion, "Your Highness, I don't understand what you mean." Eheim Rain-T smiled and said, "Washo, do you think Li Yundong is your most terrifying enemy?" "No, you're wrong." Higashi Washo looked at Eheim Rain-T in confusion. He put his hands on his knees and asked respectfully, "Your Highness, please explain." Eheim Rain-T said slowly, "China is vast and resourceful, dozens of times more than Japan. Maybe you can defeat Li Yundong today, but tomorrow you will find that Li Yunnan, Li Yunqi, and Li Yunbei will appear. They will emerge one after another, and they will eventually defeat you." Eheim Reintia's eyes suddenly became distant and full of vicissitudes. She said with emotion, "Wasn't it like this in the sacred war of East Asia decades ago? We have occupied most of the land of China and enslaved nearly half of its population, but we still failed in the end." Eheim Reinti looked at Higashi Xueqi with fanatical eyes and said, "Li Yundong is only a part of China. He is now the hegemon of the world, but it won't last long. According to my understanding of the Chinese cultivation world, there is a very strict boundary between heaven and the human world. Anyone who has reached Li Yundong's level will not survive in the human world for long." Eheim Reinti, the fanatical remnant of war, patted Higashi Xueqi's shoulder and said, "When you grow up, maybe he will no longer be in the human world." Eheim Reinti said angrily, "Then there is no way to take revenge for such a great enmity, right?" Eheim Reinti pointed to the west and said, "Yes, Li Yundong will leave the human world sooner or later, but China will not. This enemy of thousands of years will always stand beside us, waiting for us to conquer it. That's why China is your greatest enemy for life. Please remember this, Xueqi." Dongming Xueqi nodded his head as if he understood. He bit his lips so hard that the muscles on his cheeks bulged like steel bars. He did not even notice that the corner of his mouth had cracked. She smiled and said, "Don't be discouraged. Before that, we still have a chance to defeat Li Yundong, but not in cultivation. He has reached the peak of cultivation, and we can't catch up with him. Fighting with him is like hitting a stone with an egg. Wise people won't do it." Dongming Xueqi asked doubtfully, "Is there any other way?" Reinti Misaki smiled and said, "Tea ceremony." Dongming Xueqi was stunned. "Tea ceremony?" Reinti nodded and said, "That's right. You've been cultivating in the mountains all year round and don't know anything about the world, so you don't know about Li Yundong. This person is very ambitious. He wants to use the tea ceremony to spread Chinese culture to the world again, but he didn't expect that the peak of the world's tea ceremony is in Japan. If he wants to spread the tea ceremony to the world, our Yamato tea ceremony is the peak that he can never avoid." Although Dongming Xueqi did not care about the world all year round and focused on cultivation, he still knew these traditional cultures and past history very well. He knew that Chinese culture had been severely damaged in the past 100 years, and the tea ceremony was no exception. Although the tea ceremony originated in China, it was carried forward by Lu Yu, the god of tea in the Tang dynasty, and then spread to Japan. It was inherited by the Japanese tea sage Xueqi, who carried forward and finally established Japan's own tea ceremony. Later, the Japanese tea ceremony flourished and reached a very high level. Until the 1980s, many schools of Japanese tea ceremony visited China. Among them, Xueqi's 15th-generation descendant, Xueqi, came to China with a group to meet President Jiang and realize the reciprocal support of Chinese tea culture. In the eyes of the Japanese, the Chinese tea ceremony had declined to the extreme, and there was even no real tea ceremony in China. The most authentic tea ceremony in the world only existed in Japan. Therefore, if Li Yundong came to Japan to fight, the entire Japanese cultivation world would have to raise their hands and surrender. But if he came to Japan to fight, the Japanese would not agree. Instead of using his strengths, he wanted to use his weaknesses. Wasn't this giving up his strengths for his weaknesses and humiliating himself? Higashi Xueqi couldn't believe his ears. He asked in great astonishment, "Will Li Yundong really come to Japan to fight tea?" Reinti Misaki laughed and said, "Now the Tanaka conglomerate has gone to China to beg Li Yundong to go to Japan to establish the foundation of the Desangxian. Based on my understanding of him, he has always liked to face difficulties and go against heaven, so he will definitely agree. If he wants to make a name for the Desangxian in Japan and establish his position, he must participate in the tea competition." Reinti Misaki smiled proudly and said, "Xueqi, let's open our eyes and see if the invincible Li Mingwang will fall this time." Higashi Xueqi nodded doubtfully. He still couldn't believe that Li Yundong would give up his strengths for his weaknesses and come to Japan to fight tea with them. But what he didn't expect was that Li Yundong would agree. "Okay, I promise you," Li Yundong said solemnly to Tanaka Misa in front of him. Tanaka Misa, who was lying on the ground, raised her head in surprise, as if she couldn't believe her ears. Tanaka Misa looked at Li Yundong in surprise and then lay back down. Her thoughts were not as complicated as Reinti Misa and the chaebol behind her. The little girl's thoughts were very simple. Finally, She could see the abilities of this great hero in her own country. Japanese women were very strange. They had a strong national character and naturally worshipped the strong. Once they identified a person or thing, they could do things that most women in the world couldn't do. Jiang Xuemei, the wife of Jiang Bailey, who was known as the flower of the famous generals in the Republic of China, used to be the head nurse of the Japanese legation in China. Once when she was taking care of Jiang Bailey, she fell deeply in love with him. Later, she abandoned her family, changed her name, and even abandoned her nationality. She followed Jiang Bailey until her death. During the anti-Japanese war, she followed Jiang Bailey to fight against the Japanese. She cut off all contact with her relatives in Japan and didn't teach her children to speak Japanese. After Jiang Bailey died, she was a widow for the rest of her life. Gua Morua, Gu Hongming, Li Shutong, and Lu Sun had all had Japanese women who loved them deeply, and all of them were loyal to them until their deaths. Compared to men, women were born to treat things that they were interested in or liked to worship. Emotions, patriotism, family values, traditional ethics, and so on could all be discussed, but Japanese women did it in the purest way. In particular, Tanaka Misa had been spoiled since she was a child. She didn't care how the Japanese cultivation world had been ravaged by Li Yundong or how deep the hatred between the two sides was. She just wanted to see with her own eyes how amazing this great hero and master, who had been rumored to be, was. After Tanaka Misa prostrated herself, she said with joy, "Then I'm looking forward to Li Jun's performance." When Li Yundong heard Tanaka Misa's words, he couldn't help but be stunned. Performance? What performance? Tanaka Misa raised her head and looked at Li Yundong curiously. She said, "Yes, Li Jun has come to visit. Aren't you going to perform a tea fight first?" Li Yundong suddenly understood. The atmosphere of Japanese tea culture was strong, and it could be said that it went deep into every corner of daily life. Before a qualified Japanese bride got married, the tea ceremony was a compulsory course. The Japanese welcomed guests, and drinking tea was also an indispensable part of the ceremony. In this part, the hostess had to dress up and solemnly follow the procedures of the tea ceremony. In Japanese tea culture, tea fighting was also an indispensable activity. This activity originated in the Song dynasty of China and flourished in the period of Emperor Ranzong and Emperor Huizong of Song. At that time, Japanese envoys went west and introduced the tea fighting culture to Japan, and it immediately became popular. The tea culture in Japan was deeply intertwined with the cultivation world. The tea ceremony masters in Japan must have been eminent monks, and almost all of the eminent monks were good at the tea ceremony. In particular, the theory of Japanese tea and Zen cultivation was unique. If Li Yundong wanted to open a tea house or a tea shop in Japan, but didn't fight tea, that was absolutely impossible to open. This reason couldn't be simpler. Back then, when Hua Yuanjia, the hero of Tianjin, arrived in Shanghai on the first day, the main entrance was blocked by 2 boulders. There was no way anyone could get out. If Hua Yuanjia could not kick the 2 boulders away, he would have to return home immediately. This principle was applicable in the fields of fighting, martial arts, literature, tea, chess, and so on. If Yi Wen wanted to open a martial arts club in Foshan, he had to first win against other martial arts clubs before he could be qualified to open a club. If Li Yundong wanted to open a tea house in Japan, he had to win against the most famous local tea ceremony master in a tea fight. Only then would he be qualified to take root and gain their recognition. In other words, if he won against the most famous tea ceremony master in Japan, then he could pat his chest and say to the world that he was the best tea ceremony master in the world. At that time, Desanxian wouldn't need to advertise at all, and people would flock to it, especially in Japan, a country where the strong were respected. Li Yundong understood this, so he smiled and said to Tanaka Misa, "Don't worry, I will participate." Tanaka Misa immediately beamed with joy. If it weren't for the fact that her strict upbringing had been deeply ingrained in her bones, she would have jumped up with excitement. After Tanaka Misa got up, she retreated respectfully. She only put on her shoes when she reached the door. Then, she retreated out the door and bowed respectfully to close the door with the 2 bodyguards who were waiting at the door. After closing the door, Li Yundong couldn't help but feel strange. Although he instinctively felt that there was a reason behind it, he saw that Tanaka Misa was so happy and didn't seem to be pretending. He couldn't help thinking to himself, "Am I thinking too much and gauging the heart of a gentleman with my own mean measure?" Li Yundong turned his head to look at Zi Yuan, who had been silent all this time, and asked, Zi Yuan, what do you think? Zi Yuan kept shaking her head and said, the realm of tea art in Japan is so high that it's hard for others to imagine. Moreover, if we fight according to the rules of Japanese tea art, I'm not sure I can win. Li Yundong laughed and said, who said you were going to participate in the tea competition? I'll go. Zi Yuan was stunned. Zhou Qin and Su Chan, who were next to her, also looked at him with their eyes wide open. They were tongue-tied. You'll go? Li Yundong smiled and said, yes, of course I'll go. Su Chan and Zhou Qin looked at each other with strange expressions. Li Yundong was good at fighting, but the tea ceremony was probably not much better than his chess skills, right? If he went, wouldn't he be asking to be humiliated? Chapter 978. There was no more complicated relationship between countries in the world than the relationship between China and Japan. The two countries were like two sides of a mirror, and one side was almost the reflection of the other, especially in terms of cultural heritage. Please remember our website. Most of the Japanese culture originated from China. In the history of the Japanese nation, no matter which page was opened, the traces of Chinese history were deeply imprinted. In the past, the Japanese people tried hard to be Chinese, just like what the Koreans were doing now. They wanted to say that the whole world was created by the Japanese. But after doing this for a while, the Japanese were depressed and desperate to find that if they wanted to be China, Japanese culture would disappear, and the history of the entire Japanese people would have to be rewritten. Even the most extreme right-wingers wouldn't be able to complete such a huge project by deceiving themselves. Therefore, they simply stopped trying to de-Sinicize from the root. Instead, they tried to find a conclusive evidence in any aspect of culture and history. That was, the culture of the great Japanese Empire did indeed originate from China, but today in all aspects, it had already passed through China. The Japanese had done this twice when the Mongols conquered the southern Song dynasty and the Manchus conquered the Han people. The Koreans also followed suit. They refused to recognize the empires established by the Mongols and the Manchus, and at the same time, claimed that there was no real Chinese civilization in the Central Plains, and they were the true inheritors of the Central Plains culture. In modern times, the Japanese and the Koreans saw the continuous loss of Chinese culture, and the contempt in their hearts increased day by day. The mentality of being the inheritors was infinitely magnified. Therefore, the news that Li Yundong had agreed to come to Japan for a tea competition spread throughout the Japanese cultivation world and the tea ceremony world in an instant. What? You, Li Wudi, can be arrogant in China, and we can only pinch our noses and accept it. Now you can stay in China, but you actually came to Japan for a tea competition. Isn't this courting death? The Japanese tea ceremony could be said to cover all aspects of Japanese society. Sometimes, Japanese people could hold a tea party when they took a bath. If a company wanted to carry out entertainment activities to win over superiors and subordinates, it would also be held in the form of a tea party. Therefore, the radiation of the Japanese tea ceremony ranged from 80-year-old people to 8-year-old children. Therefore, the news spread from the cultivation world and the tea ceremony world as quickly as possible. No matter how hard they tried to cover it up, it could not be covered up. The relationship between the Japanese tea ceremony and the Japanese cultivation world was very close, just like the relationship between the Japanese cultivation world and the Japanese political and economic world was inseparable. This matter attracted a lot of attention from the whole country of Japan, and therefore caused a huge wave, so that the eyes of the whole country of Japan could not help but cast from the tea ceremony to the cultivation world. It was too easy to dig up a person's background in modern society. Although the Japanese cultivation world had kept silent about the painful memories that Li Yundong had caused to the Japanese cultivation world several times, especially at the foot of Tianlong Mountain, the trauma that Li Yundong and the mystical silver fox had brought to them made them want to dig out this memory from the depths of their minds. But now that it had been dug out, the Japanese cultivation world quickly became aware of the current Japanese cultivation world's hatred for Li Yundong. Although their hatred for Li Yundong had increased, it was not very high among the people of Japan. Especially after Tanaka Misa had told everyone about his deeds and praised him, it had caused a great uproar. For the sake of a beloved woman, he had resolutely fought against everyone in the world, even against all the gods and Buddhas, and had gone against heaven. This was simply a plot that would only appear in a Hollywood hero film. The most important thing was that he had actually succeeded. Many young girls in love had cried bitterly for this, claiming that they must find a man like Li Yundong in this life and die for him. Not only were the young girls fascinated by Li Yundong's behavior, but many women were also stirred up by it. The social status of Japanese women was extremely low, and they were almost completely attached to men. Although there had been a slight improvement in recent years, it had not changed the overall environment of Japan. Therefore, in Japanese society, it was possible for a boy who was in love to do such a thing for a girl. But for married men and women who had been deeply integrated into the social structure and worked hard all day long, it was almost impossible for a man to do such a thing for a woman. Therefore, these Japanese women had a particularly deep feeling about this matter. Therefore, while the name Li Yundong was still being fiercely discussed and debated in Japan, the girls and women in Japan had already raised the white flag and surrendered. All of them were looking forward to the arrival of this legendary figure. This was going to be lively. The Japanese cultivation world was very annoyed to find that the big devil they hated so much, the guy who had caused the Japanese cultivation world to go back at least 10 years, was actually so popular among the people, and he was even popular with women. How could this be? This could not be tolerated. As a result, there were visitors every day at the gates of the major tea ceremony schools in the Japanese tea ceremony world. In addition to some big shots in the political and economic circles who were concerned about the situation, the most important ones were the big shots in the Japanese cultivation world. With tears streaming down their faces, these big shots held the hands of the heads of the major tea ceremony sects and told them earnestly, "Big brother, our friends in the world of cultivation have been defeated. Whether or not we can save face in this corner depends on you." Most of the family heads or heads of the major tea ceremony sects were very close to the major cultivation sections. Almost all of them were cultivators, just like all the tea ceremony masters in Japan must be eminent monks, and all the eminent monks in Japan must be tea ceremony masters. However, the tea ceremony had a great influence in Japan. The tea ceremony and politics were inseparable. Oda Nobunaga often used tea parties to win over his subordinates. The tea party was an important political activity. In order to make up for his shortcomings, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who was born as a farmer, often used tea parties to win over people from all walks of life. Among them, the one who did this for him was the tea sage of Japan, Xueqi. Because of this, Chirikyu's reputation became more and more grand. At his peak, he could even compete with Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Therefore, it also aroused Toyotomi Hideyoshi's jealousy and resentment. In the end, he killed him. Although Senrikyu had a tragic ending, the power of the Japanese tea ceremony and tea ceremony grandmasters could be seen from this. Therefore, the masters of cultivation sects were also quite wary of these tea ceremony grandmasters. Although they had a close relationship with them, they did not reveal the true essence of cultivation at all. Therefore, these tea ceremony masters also had a lot of resentment towards the giants of the cultivation world. F***CK, you usually don't remember us, but at this time, you want us to clean up your mess? But in the current situation, they had no choice but to come out. After all, whoever could represent Japan to participate in the tea competition was a great affirmation of their own status. Therefore, these tea ceremony masters patted their chests and said, "Everyone, please rest assured. If Li Yunyang doesn't come, it's fine. If he comes, we will definitely kill him." Although the tea competition was not enough to make a person hover between life and death, it was still possible to kill Li Yunyang's arrogant spirit and make him lose his invincible face. When the big shots in the Japanese cultivation world heard this, they were immediately as excited as if they had been injected with chicken blood. However, there were also exceptions. For example, Ise Shinto and Mount Koya remained extremely calm and did not participate in this matter. One of them sat high in the Ise Grand Shrine and watched the bustling tea competition coldly, while the other sat on Mount Koya and silently watched this competition, which was known as the unprecedented prosperity of the tea ceremony in Japan in the past 10 years. The reason why Ise Shinto was calm was that Ise Chuyun had comprehended many profound meanings of cultivation in the unprecedented battle at the foot of Tianlong Mountain. He had been comprehending cultivation concepts in front of the shrine all day long. This time, Ise Chuyun was no longer limited to Shintoism. Instead, he had expanded the scope of cultivation to Buddhism and Taoism, and began to comprehend the mysteries of the world again. A person who could touch the pinnacle of the profound meaning, or was about to touch the pinnacle of the profound meaning, must be extremely broad-minded, generous, and definitely not narrow-minded. In the process of dealing with Li Yunyang, what Ise Chuyun had learned the most was that Li Yunyang's cultivation was broad and broad. He was not limited to one school or sect, and he would never stick to the rules. On the other hand, the Japanese cultivation world was born with a narrow geography, which led to the narrow-mindedness of the nation. In the end, it was very easy for their cultivation to go into a narrow misunderstanding. Shintoism was one of them. Ise Chuyun had deeply experienced the limitations and bottlenecks of Shintoism's cultivation. At this time, she was kneeling in the Jingshin Hall in the backyard of the shrine. She was quietly kneeling on the tatami in front of the hall. In front of the courtyard, there was a Japanese-style bridge and flowing water. The bamboo water wheel was moving up and down, making an empty sound, full of rhythm and zen. Ise Shunguang was also kneeling on the tatami. He tilted his head and looked at Asichyun, who was looking at the sky with her eyes closed. He smiled and said, "Chuyun, what do you see?" Asichyun slowly opened her eyes and said, "I see a tsunami coming towards us." The witches and goddesses of Shintoism were extremely respected, not only because of their strong spiritual power and high status, but also because they were all figures who could communicate with God and could see a certain future under certain circumstances. Ise Shunguang was silent for a long time before asking, "Chuyun, will we be spared?" Ise Chuyun turned her face and said silently, "No one can escape this disaster." Ise Shunguang was slightly shocked and said, "How could a tea battle have such power?" Chuyun shook her head. "It's not just a tea battle. The tea battle is just the beginning." After that, she closed her eyes again, as if she had fallen into a deep meditation. Ise Shunguang raised his head and looked at the surging wind and clouds in the sky. He sighed softly and shook his head slowly. At this time, Li Yunyang, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and his eldest disciple, Zhou Qin, had just arrived in Japan. As soon as they arrived, the whole country immediately became excited. The cultivation world, the tea ceremony world, and NHK and other media swarmed over. Chapter 979. Although the whole country of Japan had paid great attention to this tea competition, they had frantically tracked down and reported their every move as soon as they landed. Although paparazzi and reporters were everywhere in modern society, it was too easy to find out a person's whereabouts. But this time, their opponents and targets were Li Yundong, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin. Among them, one represented the highest peak of the Chinese cultivation world, and the other three were the Fairy Immortal, Earth Immortal, and Fox Immortal, who had become famous in the Japanese cultivation world after the battle with Nazuno. If they wanted to hide, no one in the world could find them. Therefore, after Li Yundong and the others showed up, it was as if they had disappeared from the world, and they could no longer be found. The Japanese press was going crazy. They couldn't wait to turn over the place where Li Yundong lived and search for him. But they couldn't find any trace of Li Yundong and the others. They had no choice but to focus their attention on the Japanese tea ceremony circle. Japanese people loved tea, especially tea ceremony banquets and tea battles. The tea battle in the Japanese tea ceremony was completely different from the tea battle in China. There were many schools in the Japanese tea ceremony world. There were more than 20 schools such as the Yuri family, the Biao family, the Warrior Path family, the Zongpian family, the Nanfeng family, the Tsurui family, the Servo family, the Yuanzhou family, the Shizhou family, and so on. However, the famous schools in Japan had deep connections with the Japanese tea sage, Senrikyu. At this time, Li Yundong was sitting cross-legged on the tatami, closing his eyes to rest. Next to him, Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin were either kneeling or sitting cross-legged on the ground, watching the TV report. There was a live broadcast of the tea battle between the various schools in the Japanese tea ceremony world. This situation was very similar to when Wu Qingyuan was invincible in Japan. The highest tournament in the Japanese Go world, the Haninbo tournament, gathered the strongest Go players in Japan and let them fight it out one by one. Then, the strongest player was sent to Wu Qingyuan for him to kill. As a high-profile visitor, Li Yundong was like a shark, immediately stirring up the originally peaceful water of the Japanese tea ceremony world, and it became turbulent and undulating. Although Zhou Qin had a certain understanding of tea drinking, it was only limited to the quality of tea leaves. She might not have a deep understanding of the tea ceremony. Su Chan was the same. Although the little girl had been taught traditional cultivation by Ao Wushuang since she was a child, she was helpless. Her cultivation was half-baked. If it weren't for the chance, it would be wishful thinking for her to cultivate to the level of the nine-tailed fox in this life. Therefore, The two of them stared at the tea contest on the TV with their eyes wide open. From time to time, they would chatter with each other. What faction is this? Xueqi pointed at a man in a solemn loose kimono on the TV and asked with wide round eyes. Xueqi tried hard to see a few Chinese characters occasionally appearing in a series of Japanese words on the TV screen. She said with difficulty, "It seems to be something like so Niliu or something." She turned her head to look at Ziyuan and asked, "Ziyuan, what does it say?" Ziyuan stared at the rapidly scrolling subtitles and said, "It says that the one appearing now is So Niliu Jiyuan." Xueqi asked curiously, "What kind of faction is So Niliu?" Ziyuan stared at it and said quickly, "So Niliu is one of the early tea ceremony schools in Japan. It was founded in the Azuchi Momoyama era, that is, between 1568 and 1600 AD, by So Niliu Xueqi, who is the senior brother of the Japanese tea sage Senrikyu. This school has been protected by the West Hope Temple, which is also known as the Pure Land sect, for generations. It can be said that it is a huge tea ceremony group under the influence of the Pure Land sect." Xueqi and Xueqi suddenly understood. Although the two of them didn't know much about the Japanese tea ceremony, they still knew Senrikyu. He was a giant in the Japanese tea ceremony, and even the world tea ceremony. He was a towering mountain that could not be bypassed no matter what angle one looked at it from. He had developed the Japanese tea ceremony to a very high level. In terms of realm alone, his realm was no lower than that of Lu Yu, the god of tea of China. Therefore, although they didn't know much about So Niliu, when it was mentioned that its founder, So Niliu Xueqi, was Senrikyu's senior brother, the two of them were immediately in awe. They stared at So Niliu with their eyes wide open, wanting to see how good his tea fighting skills were. They saw the solemn atmosphere in the tea house on the live TV. Even the sound in the TV seemed to have disappeared when the island appeared. Everyone was calm and focused, staring at the island. The status of Japanese tea ceremony grandmaster is extremely high. Over the years, when Japanese shrines hold sacrifices, there must be a large-scale sacred and solemn tea ceremony. Among them, Japan's famous Toyokuni Shrine's tea ceremony is held by Yoshinobu Jiyuan. The Serval family had been blessed by the Pure Land True sect for generations. Although it was impossible for him to obtain the true inheritance of the Pure Land True sect's powerful magic, his realm of Zen cultivation was not low. Every step he took was extremely rigorous. Anyone with a discerning eye would know that every step he took was exactly the same. It was as if he was a programmed robot. There was absolutely no difference at all. Especially when he walked into the tea room, dressed in a black kimono with white embroidery, holding the famous eggplant of the Okinawa clan, according to the prescribed position, took the prescribed tea set, and then according to the prescribed order of making tea, according to the prescribed etiquette, the two of them really sucked in a breath of cold air. When foreigners or outsiders saw Japanese tea ceremony grandmasters making tea, they would only think that their movements were elegant and slow, but they could not see the reason behind it. However, Xueqi and Xueqi were both discerning people. Naturally, they could see at a glance that every move of the island had been tempered. It was just like when he made tea according to the most rigorous etiquette of the three major etiquettes of the tea ceremony: charcoal etiquette, strong tea etiquette, and weak tea etiquette. This Serval family had extremely strict standards and requirements for the use of the round bamboo brush, the height of the lifting position, the way the small silk cloth was folded, the way the tea ladle was handled, and the method and strength of pounding the tea leaves. He would not increase or decrease a point. The other judges who were kneeling in the tea house stared at the island like hawks. As long as he made the slightest mistake, points would be deducted immediately. Xueqi and Xueqi were dumbfounded in front of the TV, and Ziyuan was also frowning. According to the Japanese tea ceremony, even if Lu Yu, the tea god of China, came, he would lose. Xueqi and Xueqi naturally thought of this. They looked at Ziyuan, who had the highest cultivation of tea art, as if asking for help. They wanted to see what she could do. Xueqi quickly glanced at Li Yundong, who was sitting next to him with his eyes closed and turned a deaf ear to everything around him. She lowered her voice and said to Ziyuan, "Ziyuan, what should we do? We don't understand this kind of tea competition at all." Xueqi couldn't help but complain. "Yes, this is too abnormal. Do Japanese people have to be so exaggerated and complicated to drink tea?" Soon, she asked curiously, "Sister Ziyuan, do Japanese people always fight tea like this?" Ziyuan frowned and shook her head. "No, it's not like this. The tea competition in Japan is different from the tea competition in China. The tea competition in China originated from the gathering of scholars. The scholars in China were the privileged class in feudal society. In other words, tea parties and tea competitions were activities that only the privileged class could enjoy. But when the tea competition spread to Japan, it evolved into a unique activity of the Japanese privileged class, that is, the samurai class. The tea competition also changed from an elegant thing to a gathering to expand social relations, show off all kinds of goods imported from China, and eat and drink to their heart's content. Zi Yuan stared at Jia Yuan's every move, as if she was memorizing all his movements. She said quickly, "At the beginning of this tea party, it's very noisy, as if they are going to a fair. It's very improper. At the tea party, there are many people who are bare-chested, naked, and crazy." It wasn't until 1489 that the 8th generation of shogunate, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, began to regulate the tea competition and tea parties. At this time, the tea party and tea competition in Japan began to slowly become formal, sweeping away the previous chaotic atmosphere. Among them, Ashikaga Yoshimasa's cultural attendant Nengami made strict rules for the tea ceremony, such as the placement of the tea set, the way to hold it, the order of movements, the route of movement, and the number of steps to move. The tea competition and tea ceremony in Japan were developed on this basis. As Zi Yuan spoke, she couldn't help looking at Li Yundong. Seeing that he was indifferent to all this, she frowned even more and sighed in her heart. This guy is really not anxious, but the eunuch is anxious. We are anxious to death here, but he is calm and steady. Doesn't he know that knowing oneself and knowing the enemy will win 100 battles? If he doesn't know anything about the Japanese tea ceremony, how can he win the tea competition? And Zi Yuan looked down at a purple teapot in front of her, and she was even more worried in her heart. Although my top-grade Huangshan Yunfeng tea is an immortal tea, I'm afraid it won't be enough to compete with the top-grade tea stored by the Japanese tea family for generations on such a grand occasion. There were only a few aspects to a tea competition. The quality of the tea was extremely important. If the hardware was defeated at the beginning, then there would be no need to fight. No matter how fast the abacus was, it was impossible to be faster than a large electronic computer. Thinking of this, Zi Yuan was worried. She was distracted, so she didn't see the movements of Xiao Dao on the TV just now. When she came to her senses, Xiao Dao had already completed all the movements on the TV and slowly left the field. Jia Yuan was a giant and guru in the Japanese tea ceremony. As soon as he left the field, all the referees on the field stood up and applauded, then bowed respectfully to see him off. Even the host was so excited that he shouted, "This is the real art of tea ceremony, this is the real tea ceremony." But before he finished shouting, there was a tsunami of cheers outside the competition venue. Soon, the host shouted enthusiastically. Su Chan and Zhou Qin couldn't understand at all. They just looked blankly at the camera on the TV, which was aimed at an old man in his 50s with slightly gray temples. The old man was wearing a black and white kimono, walking slowly, and a line of words was typed on the TV screen. Although Zhou Qin and Su Chan didn't understand Japanese, they could understand a few Chinese characters in it. It clearly said, "Qian Zhengji, the 16th generation descendant of the tea sage Qian Rixiu." Su Chan and Zhou Qin looked at each other. Su Chan couldn't help but ask in surprise, "Is this Qian Zhengji so famous?" Zi Yuan said with a heavy heart, "Qian Rixiu's prestige in the Japanese tea ceremony world is unimaginable to ordinary people. The Qian Jialyo he founded is the most influential tea ceremony school in Japan, and the Qian Jialyo represented by Qian Zhengji is the leading school in the Japanese tea ceremony world, just like the Longhu Mountain of Chinese Taoism and the Wutai Mountain of Chinese Buddhism. The level of tea ceremony of the island in front of us is already so high. I really can't imagine how high Qian Zhengji's level of tea ceremony will be." While she was speaking slowly, she saw a few people suddenly come in from the front yard gate. The leader was led by a Japanese man who kept bowing and walking inside. As he walked, he shouted, "Master, I'm here. Why didn't you tell me that such a big thing had happened?" Zi Yuan turned her head and was overjoyed. She stood up and greeted him. "You're finally here. Where's the tea? Did you bring the tea I asked for?" It was even later, but tonight should be the last busy night recently. I've been really busy recently, staying up all night every day. Besides, which hero is so generous as to stamp the cover of my book so that it can't be seen? Chapter 980. It was none other than Chen Wankai, the second disciple of Li Yundong, who was much older than him. Chen Wankai had gone abroad to discuss business before, and no one had informed him of Li Yundong's situation. By the time he got the news and rushed back, Li Yundong had already agreed to go to Japan to participate in the tea competition. Zi Yuan couldn't stop Li Yundong, so she had to think of ways to help Li Yundong win in the tea competition. One of them was to ask Chen Wankai to use his connections and resources to get the best tea in the world. After Chen Wankai received the news from Zi Yuan, he immediately set about this matter. In this world, it was all thanks to him that he was able to get a set of extremely precious tea sets and a jar of extremely rare tea leaves in the shortest time possible. Behind him, his daughter, Shen Hui, was holding the tea set. Shen Hui carefully held a set of wooden tea sets in her hands and walked carefully. After entering the door, she dared to look inside. When she saw Li Yundong, she quickly lowered her eyes. After the Japanese boss welcomed the two of them into the door, he turned around and left. But no matter how he thought about it, he couldn't have imagined that these people were Li Yundong and his group, who were now the talk of Japan. After Chen Wankai entered the door, he saw that Li Yundong was meditating with his eyes closed. He was stunned, and then his footsteps were very light. He walked to Zi Yuan's side and asked in a low voice, "Master, are you meditating?" Zi Yuan smiled bitterly and said, "I don't know. Maybe. What tea did you bring?" Chen Wankai smiled mysteriously and said, "Open it and see for yourself." Shan Hui stepped forward and handed the teapot to Zi Yuan. Zi Yuan took it. As soon as she opened the lid, a fragrant smell came from inside. The fragrance assailed her nostrils, and in an instant, the whole room and yard were filled with the fresh smell of tea. Su Chan couldn't help but say, "It smells so good. What tea is this?" Zhou Qin also widened her eyes and looked at it. Zi Yuan glanced at the teapot and saw that the tea leaves in the teapot were black and long, like melon seeds. They didn't look obvious, but they smelled fragrant and had the fragrance of orchids. She raised her head and asked, "Wui de Hong Pao?" Chen Wankai excitedly gave a thumbs up. "That's right." Zhou Qin asked curiously, "Is it the De Hong Pao from the mother tree?" De Hong Pao could be said to be one of the most valuable tea leaves in the world. Because the tea trees grew on the cliffs of Mount Wui's Jiolong Nest, where the sunlight was short, the reflected light was abundant, and the temperature difference between day and night was large. Moreover, there was a fine spring at the top of the cliff all year round. There were only 6 De Hong Pao tea trees in the world that could grow in such an environment. Although scientists had used asexual reproduction in the 1980s to reproduce De Hong Pao in batches, due to the change in their growing environment, the tea quality of these De Hong Pao tea leaves could not be mentioned in the same breath as the tea leaves picked from the cliffs of Jiolong Nest. Because of this, the 6 De Hong Pao trees were also known as the mother trees. The tea leaves harvested from them were worth tens of times more than gold. The rarest thing about the De Hong Pao that Chen Wankai brought was that it happened to be tea leaves picked during the Qingming festival. In the tea leaves, there is a saying, 3 days early is a treasure, 3 days late becomes grass. It meant that the tea leaves picked before and after the Guyub season would have a completely different quality. The poet Hu Jiao also wrote, "Chalcedony is cooked before the Guyu in the morning, and spring tea is the freshest." It was referring to the tea leaves before the Guyu, which were of the highest quality. The Qingming festival was the season before the Guyu. Although this season was already a useless cultivation time for the cultivation world, it was the golden time for the tea world. The Japanese tea ceremony world was naturally well aware of this, so almost every tea battle in the Japanese tea ceremony world was held during the Qingming festival. At this time, the tea leaves were fresh and tender, which was the most suitable for tea battles. Therefore, Chen Wankai proudly pointed to the tea leaves in the tea can and said, "This was bought by a tea house owner who spent a lot of money to get it through the back door. In the end I robbed it." This kind of mother tree, De Hong Pao, before the rain, was not something that could be bought with money alone. No one knew what methods Shen Wankai had used to snatch these tea leaves, which were dozens of times more expensive than gold, from the hands of others. Su Chan and Zhou Qin naturally knew how expensive this tea was. Even though Li Yundong was not a poor man now, if de Sanxian wanted to buy such top-grade tea, he had no way to do so even if he had money, and even if he had connections, he didn't have enough money. Zhou Qin picked up a piece of tea with her hand, sniffed it, and said with a smile, "This is good. At least I won't lose to others in terms of tea leaves." Su-chan looked at the tea leaves and blinked. She couldn't wait to make a pot of it now and taste the tea leaves that were dozens of times more expensive than gold. Zi Yuan's heart also relaxed a little. She looked at the tea set in Shen Hui's hand. Seeing her gaze, Shen Hui untied the outer packaging. Zi Yuan saw that there was an antique tea set inside. The first thing she saw was the rabbit hair teacup. Zi Yuan looked up at Li Yundong and asked, Li Yundong, say something. What do you think of such a tea set and tea leaves? Li Yundong smiled slightly, opened his eyes, took a look, and said with a smile, very good. Su-chan, Zi Yuan, and the others were all delighted, but as soon as they smiled, Li Yundong shook his head and said, but we still can't win the tea competition. The people in the room looked at each other. Chen Wankai couldn't help but ask anxiously, Master, what else are you missing? Tell me, I will definitely find a way to get it. Li Yundong laughed and pointed to Chen Zhengji, who was performing the tea ceremony on TV, and said, do you think it's possible for us to win if we make a last-minute effort and compete with the Japanese tea ceremony according to their rules? Zi Yuan leaned forward slightly and asked, Li Yundong, you don't want to lose the game on purpose like you did with Zhang Tianchi, do you? Li Yundong shook his head and said, no, Celestial Master Zhang is a gentleman. Besides, this is a private duel, which is harmless. But now the tea competition has caused a lot of noise. I can afford to lose, but the Chinese tea ceremony world and the cultivation world that I represent can't afford to lose. And Li Yundong stood up, smiled and said, I can lose to anyone but the Japanese. Su-chan and Zhou Qin looked at each other and couldn't help asking, then what about you? How can you win? Li Yundong smiled confidently, got up, and walked out of the door, saying, let's go. It's time to go to the banquet. 2 days after Li Yundong went out, the tea competition that caused a sensation in the tea ceremony world in Japan was finally decided. After a fierce competition between the Neon family, the Neon family, the Neon family, and the Neon family, which specialized in serving the nobles in Japan, finally won and represented Japan in the tea competition with Li Yundong. The place of the tea competition was set in the Bus Hen Nunnery in Shangjing, where the Neon family lived. Early in the morning, there were all kinds of news vehicles parked near the Bus Hen Nunnery in Kyoto. Countless TV stations and reporters gathered there. The reporters and hosts from various Japanese TV stations were loudly reporting what was about to happen here. The head of the Neon family, Chen Zhengji, had already taken a bath and changed his clothes early, waiting at the gate of the Bus Hen Nunnery. Although the heads of the other Japanese schools did not obtain the final qualification, they had also taken a bath and changed their clothes early. They came to the Bus Hen Nunnery and waited for the beginning of this unprecedented event. Since Li Yundong and the others had not arrived yet, the reporters and hosts of the Japanese TV stations focused on the background of Li Yundong and the others. The Japanese press was relatively free, and there was little concealment of Li Yundong's identity and background. However, the indirect impact and loss of Li Yundong and the mystical silver fox, who was related to him, on the Japanese cultivation world in the Battle of Xueqi and Mount Tianlong, were kept a secret. Tanaka Misa had also taken a bath early and changed into a beautiful kimono. She followed Ise Chuyun to the Bus Hen Nunnery to wait for the tea party to begin. She was accompanied by the daughters of the major Japanese conglomerates and nobles. They walked together, chattering and guessing the result of the tea party along the way. When they arrived at the Bus Hen Nunnery, they saw the famous masters of the tea ceremony sitting in a row in the corridor at the entrance of the Bus Hen Nunnery. In the lobby next to the Bus Hen Nunnery sat the important figures of the cultivation world. These people were kneeling on the spot, and each of them had an amazing momentum. A group of people looked at them in unison, like knives and axes. These noble ladies and childs, who were usually arrogant, were so nervous that they did not dare to breathe. They bowed all the way, walked through the corridor, and came to another courtyard. After sitting down, they breathed a sigh of relief. When a gust of wind blew through the hall, they found that their backs were covered with a layer of cold sweat. It was very uncomfortable. Ise Izumo was supposed to sit with Ise Shengguang in the lobby where the cultivation world was located, but she was very close to Tanaka Misa, so she was dragged to sit with the group of noble young masters and young ladies. As soon as the two of them sat down, Tanaka Misa couldn't wait to ask, Chiyun, who do you think will win this tea battle? Without thinking, Ise Chiyun immediately said, of course, His Highness the Wise King will win. Tanaka Misa asked curiously, why? A young and handsome man next to her couldn't help but interrupt. "Miss Xueqi, you're wrong. So many of us came in just now, and we were watched by so many great masters and great craftsmen. Not to mention performing an extremely strict tea ceremony. We can't even breathe normally. I think it's good enough that the Chinese won't be scared to the point of urinating and defecating in such an environment." At this time, the others laughed out loud. As soon as they laughed, the other tea ceremony masters and cultivation masters on both sides looked at them, and they were immediately frightened into silence. In Japan, the prestige of the tea ceremony masters and cultivation masters was extremely high. Every move of theirs had unimaginable majesty and aura. When these noble young ladies and young masters entered just now, the great pressure on the field left a very deep impression in their hearts. Many of them had been trained as successors since they were young. They were all people who had experienced great storms and seen the world. To put it bluntly, seeing the emperor every day was as normal as eating and drinking. But when they came in before, it was as if they had entered the gates of hell. They were scared to death. They really couldn't imagine how a person could complete the complicated and strict process of tea battle in such an environment. Perhaps it was lucky that they didn't pee their pants, right? Chapter 981. The man who spoke was called Fujiwara Tangha, a direct descendant of the Fujiwara clan, one of the foremost famous aristocratic families in Japan. Izumo looked at Fujiwara Tangha in front of him and sighed in his heart. Fujiwara Tangha had a good appearance. He had thick eyebrows, big eyes like stars, and a nose like an egg. He was tall and strong, standing at 187 meters tall. He had an innate aristocratic temperament. When he was studying at the University of Tokyo, he had once caused a commotion among all the girls in the school. Although Fujiwara Tangha was not an idiot, he was still far from his ancestor. His ancestor was Fujiwara Bubi, a famous minister during the Great Reform launched by Emperor Xueqi of Japan. This Fujiwara Bubi was the actual founder of the Fujiwara clan, one of the foremost famous aristocratic families in Japan. The Fujiwara clan was also one of the first great families in the cultivation world of Japan. Their ancestors had held the position of great priest for generations. In particular, they once had a marriage alliance with the Tachibana clan, one of the foremost famous aristocratic families in Japan. However, it was a pity that the Fujiwara family had now declined. They only had the halo and title of nobility. The 3 generations of Fujiwara Tianhe were all ordinary people who had never come into contact with cultivation. They only had an empty shell of bright porcelain. But they were still immersed in the glorious history of their family, intoxicated by the intoxicating halo of beauty. They refused to open their eyes to look at the world, acting like they were above their heads. On the surface, Fujiwara Tangha admired Tanaka Misa very much, but in fact, he wanted to use Tanaka Misa to strike up a conversation with Izumo. Although he was born into a noble family, and his ancestors had held important positions such as great priest and great priest for generations, the Ise family was also one of the most famous aristocratic families in Japan. In particular, Izumo was known as the most outstanding genius in Japan in the past 200 years. He was also the Kitagawa goddess. Not only was his background no worse than Fujiwara Tangha's, but in terms of cultivation, strength, and internal appearance, it was enough to make a man like Fujiwara Tangha feel a sense of admiration. If it were not for this opportunity, he would not have dared to take the initiative to speak to this person who was known as the Ice Mountain treasure of the Japanese cultivation world. Izumo listened to Fujiwara Tianhe's words and sighed in his heart. He put his palms together and shook his head. How can a summer insect speak of ice? Fujiwara Tianhe's face turned very ugly. He was usually an eloquent person, but at this moment, he was choked and speechless. Fujiwara Tianhe forced a smile and said, "Chuyin, what do you mean by that?" Izumo glanced at Fujiwara Tianhe and sighed. Never underestimate an enemy that hates you, or it will affect your judgment of him. Although in the eyes of many of us, Li Yundong is an enemy of the alien race, you have to admit that his cultivation has reached the level of God. What he can do is not what mortals like you and I can imagine. Izumo was about the same age as these young masters and young ladies, and she was the goddess of the Ise Grand Shrine. Even if she met the Mikado would be very polite to her. Therefore, when she sat among this group of people, she seemed to be the leader. When these words came out, everyone was shocked, even Tanaka Misa. Tanaka Misa knew her best friend's ability best. She said in surprise, "Izumo, if you are also a mortal, then what are we? You are not a mortal, are you?" Everyone agreed when they heard this. Although they were arrogant, they were extremely convinced of Ise Izumo. In their opinion, if Ise Izumo was an ordinary mortal, then what were they? Insects? Aliens? Reptiles? At this time, if someone like Ise Shenguang was here, he might have just laughed it off. However, Ise Izumo was a person who did things her own way. She only cared about what she said and didn't care about what others thought. Thus, she let out a long sigh and said something shocking. "In front of the battler Heavenly Lord, we are all mortals." Battler Tianzuan. Although the young masters and young ladies here didn't know who had given Li Yundong this nickname, at this time, they could feel a kind of cold majesty from these 4 simple words. It was as if he was looking down on the world, and it was about to come out. They were all silent and speechless for a long time. The Bus Hen Nunnery was originally quiet. The Japanese tea ceremony paid attention to harmony, respect, purity, and silence. The tea ceremony masters here were almost all taciturn. A person could sit in front of a tea set for a whole day, just like an eminent monk. Therefore, when they sat in the corridor of the Bus Hen Nunnery, they were like a row of sculptures, motionless and not even blinking, let alone whispering to each other. Most of the other leaders of the Japanese cultivation world were the same. Therefore, as soon as these young masters and young ladies quieted down, the whole Bus Hen Nunnery immediately fell into silence. It was so quiet that even a pin drop could be heard. Only the hosts and reporters of the major media outside the Bus Hen Nunnery were talking about the situation of the Bus Hen Nunnery to the cameras. While it was quiet here, suddenly there was a burst of noise outside. The people in the Bus Hen Nunnery could hear the decibels of these hosts and reporters suddenly increase several times. Almost all of them were exclaiming and screaming, and there was a huge noise like a tsunami outside. Most of these noises were the screams of fanatical women. The screams shook the sky and made people stare. The young masters and young ladies in the Bus Hen Nunnery stirred and stood up one after another. They couldn't wait to look out and see what was going on outside. The masters of the various schools of tea ceremony sitting in front of the Bus Hen Nunnery also leaned forward one after another, their eyes slightly widening. They knew that it must be Li Yundong. Sure enough, it didn't take long for a young man to appear in front of the Bus Hen Nunnery. This man's face was like jade, and his skin was as delicate as smooth porcelain. Even looking at him from a distance, one would feel that his body seemed to reflect light, and his whole body was shrouded in a faint halo. It really made the young ladies on the scene palpitate with excitement. Their hearts were beating wildly, and their eyes were staring straight ahead without knowing it. Even Tingyuan Tianhe, who had disapproved of Li Yunyong before, couldn't help but widen his eyes. In terms of appearance and figure, he was almost better than the man in front of him, but this man had an indescribable temperament. He stood there without saying a word, with a slight smile on the corner of his mouth, giving people a feeling of a spring breeze caressing their faces. It made people unable to feel any hostility towards him. Even though he was arrogant and narrow-minded, he couldn't help but feel that he was not as good as him. Even the Chinese exclusion faction of the Japanese cultivation world, who had hated Li Yundong so much before, couldn't help but be tongue-tied when they saw him at this time. They couldn't produce any hatred or anger in their hearts. It was like a raging fire meeting the spring rain, or ice meeting the warm sun. Unknowingly, their anger was dissolved by Li Yundong's faint smile and disappeared without a trace. When a master like Asi Chuyun saw this, he couldn't help but sigh in his heart. His Highness Wisdom King's cultivation has already transcended the mortal world and returned to nature. As she was thinking about this, she couldn't help but get up and walk outside. As soon as Asi Chuyun moved, the others in the hall came to their senses. Everyone watched as Asi Chuyun walked to the door of the Bus Hen Nunnery and bowed slightly to Li Yundong. Li Yundong also bowed slightly and returned the salute with a smile. Then she went straight out. Everyone was stunned. Tanaka Misa seemed to have woken up from a dream. She immediately jumped up and chased after him. When she reached the door, she bowed to Li Yundong with a red face. Without waiting for Li Yundong to return the salute, she ran away in a hurry, as if she would be on fire if she stayed any longer. As soon as Tanaka Misa chased after him, she saw countless long and short cameras shining at her. The cameras almost drowned her. Tanaka Misa was shocked. After squeezing out, she grabbed Isi Chuyun's hand and whispered in surprise, "Chuyun, what are you doing?" Where are you going? Aisachiyun said without looking back. Go back. Tanaka Misa was shocked. The tea competition hasn't started yet. Where are you going? Aisachiyun turned around and shook his head. No, it's over. Tanaka Misa was stunned. What do you mean? Aisachiyun sighed and said, Li Yundong's realm has reached the pinnacle, transcended the mortal realm, and returned to nature. Although the cultivation of fighting methods and the tea competition are different, the principles are the same. Qian Zhengji can't win. The winner of this tea competition has already been decided. As soon as Ise Chuyun finished speaking, there was a huge uproar around. The two of them were talking, but the reporters and hosts next to them heard it clearly. Ise Chuyun could understand Li Yundong's realm, but they might not be able to. It was like people knew that diamonds were precious, but animals regarded them as rubble. These people immediately clamored and pointed their microphones at Ise Izumo. Some of the more radical ones even questioned him face to face. There was a lot of noise outside, so the people in the bus hen nunnery naturally heard it. The faces of the big shots in the cultivation world of Japan changed. No matter what, it was not a glorious thing to be ridiculed by their own people in front of Li Yundong. Moreover, the person who had done this was an important genius in Japan. Even though Qian Zhengji had cultivated for many years, his mind had long been as calm as still water. At this time, he couldn't help but look angry. He got up, bowed to Li Yundong, and made a gesture of invitation with his hand. The bus hen nunnery was not big. After the cultivators, tea ceremony masters, and noble young ladies were all sitting in the lobby, it became a little crowded. Therefore, the reporters and hosts of the TV station were not allowed to come in. They were all waiting outside. Only Kay, with his unique conditions and background, had set up a few cameras in the bus hen nunnery for the convenience of the live broadcast. Except for the staff who were on duty, everyone else was driven out. Therefore, although the people outside did not know Qian Zhengji's actions, the host in charge of the live broadcast in the TV station shouted loudly, calling it Qian Zhengji's declaration of war. The hosts in front of the TV all supported Qian Zhengji with righteous indignation. They denounced Ise Chuyun's betrayal and said with certainty, cultivation and the tea ceremony are two completely different worlds. The battle of methods is about profound spiritual energy and powerful magic, while the battle of tea is about tea art. As the saying goes, different professions are like different mountains. Ise Chuyun's words are really inappropriate, childish and ridiculous. At this time, Li Yundong followed Qian Zhengji to the tea hall of the bus hen nunnery alone. Qian Zhengji bowed slightly and said in a deep voice, Mr. Li, please show us the Chinese tea ceremony. He wanted Li Yundong to show his tea art first. He was a great master in the tea ceremony world of Japan and even the world. It could be said that he stood at the peak of the world's tea ceremony. If he made a move first, the people who came later basically had no chance of winning. It could be said that they would be suppressed by his momentum and not be able to exert their normal strength at all. Therefore, he took the initiative to suggest that Li Yundong go first, which could be regarded as a show of strength. But unexpectedly, Li Yundong smiled slightly, bowed politely, and said, I dare not. As the saying goes, a guest should follow the host's wishes. Please go first, because I'm afraid that after I make the tea, you won't dare to make a move. This sentence immediately caused an uproar in the crowd. Everyone stood up immediately. Qian Zhengji was even more shocked and angry. The host in the TV was dumbfounded and almost couldn't believe his ears. No one in the world had ever dared to say such a thing in front of Qian Lixio's descendants. The young man in front of them was the first. Was there anyone more arrogant than him in this world? Many Japanese viewers in front of the TV were stunned for a while, and then they were all furious. They all scolded, Go eat shit. Lord Qian Zhengji, teach this arrogant bastard a lesson. I still didn't have time to update before Christmas. I'm sorry to all my readers and wish you a late Christmas. Did you have a happy Christmas? I hope that you can be so happy every day in the future. In addition, I haven't seen the cover every day recently. There are chapters everywhere. I spent a lot of money. Finally, let me say something else. Haruba Asakura dance. Hello, Chapter 982. Long Yuan Shengshue's words angered almost all the Japanese people in front of the TV. Su Chan, Zi Yuan, Zhou Qin, Shen Wan Kai, and Shen Hui immediately felt the great changes around them. Shen Hui and Chen Wan Kai were different from Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin. She was just an ordinary person. Although she was a real rich second-generation young lady, she had not experienced many storms and waves. Although Chen Wan Kai had experienced a lot of storms and waves, there were many tea ceremony grandmasters and leaders of various sects in the cultivation world around him. Even though he was a business tycoon, he could not bear such strong pressure. For a moment, his chest felt stuffy, as if there was a huge rock weighing 10,000 kilograms on his body, and he could not breathe. Shen Hui was even more unbearable. Her pretty face turned purple and red. It was Zi Yuan who was beside her, who reached out and pressed her shoulder, that she breathed a sigh of relief. Su Chan and the others were only allowed to enter the nunnery. They looked into the distance from the porch at the entrance. They saw Li Yundong sitting cross-legged in the hall of the nunnery, motionless. Qian Zhengji leaned forward slightly and said angrily, "Mr. Li, I don't think this is the etiquette of the great Chinese, is it?" Li Yundong smiled slightly and said, "The most basic premise of the so-called etiquette is honesty. Treating others with sincerity is the way to treat others. I'm just telling you my inner thoughts. How is that impolite?" His words were very sincere, but it was like adding oil to the fire, causing many Japanese to shout. The national pride of the Japanese was sometimes very fragile. Being provoked by Li Yundong like this, many people immediately jumped up. Even some tea ceremony masters couldn't hold back and cursed him repeatedly. Chen Wan Kai and Shen Hui were watching from the side with worried faces. They didn't know how Li Yundong would fight in such a hostile environment, but Su Chan, Zi Yuan, and Zhou Qin suddenly understood at the same time, and then they were overjoyed. Shen Hui saw this and couldn't help but ask Zhou Qin, "Zhou Qin, what are you so happy about?" "I was scared to death." Zhou Qin lowered her voice, as if she was afraid that the people around her would hear her. She whispered, "This is Master's provocation. The Japanese tea ceremony pays attention to the 4 key words of harmony, respect, purity, and silence. Only when these 4 words are achieved can it be called the real Japanese tea ceremony. Look at Chen Zhengji now. He doesn't even have the words peaceful and quiet anymore." Shen Hui suddenly understood. "Ah," she asked in a low voice with some excitement. "Then does Li Yundong have a good chance of winning?" Chen Wan Kai turned his head and glared at his daughter. He scolded her in a low voice, "You're so rude. How can you call someone like that?" He, an old man with gray hair, had to call Li Yundong master, but his daughter called him by his name. What kind of logic was this? Shen Hui stuck out her tongue, tilted her head, and looked at Zi Yuan and the others with hope. Zi Yuan nodded slightly and said in a low voice, "In theory, but I don't think Chen Zhengji will be so easily provoked. Otherwise, he won't be qualified to ascend to the peak of the Japanese tea ceremony." After Zi Yuan said this, Chen Zhengji slowly sat up straight. The anger on his face disappeared little by little. He nodded slowly and said, "Since Mr. Li is so honest, I understand. I will do my best to defeat you. This is also my way of being honest." Li Yundong chuckled and stretched out his hand to make a gesture. "Please." His movements were relaxed and natural, as if he were at home, not at all like he was in a wolf's den full of hostility. Chen Zhengji took a deep look at Li Yundong. As a half-cultivator who had close contact with the cultivation world, he naturally knew the horror of the man in front of him. After he sat down, he took a deep breath, and the anger on his face slowly subsided. His aura was as calm as an ancient well, extremely clear, but at the same time, so deep that the bottom could not be seen. After making a gesture of "please," Chen Zhengji stood up, walked to the door, and bowed to the lobby, the surroundings, and the direction of the cameras. At this moment, the Bus Hen Nunnery immediately quieted down. This place represented the holy land of Japanese tea ceremony. When the 16th generation of Qian Rixiu's descendants were about to have a tea battle, even the angry Japanese could feel the influence of Chen Zhengji's peaceful and quiet aura. After Chen Zhengji bowed, he walked into the room. Every step was delicate and light, like a dance, with a strong sense of rhythm and elegance. Su Chan and the others saw that Chen Zhengji was obviously a man over 50 years old, but his every move revealed an extremely elegant beauty, which was pleasing to the eye. Chen Zhengji came to the tea table, carefully lit the charcoal fire, and began to boil water. At this time, he didn't move much, just quietly waiting for the tea to boil. Zi Yuan stared at the field and suddenly said in a low voice, "Oh no, we still lack a very important thing." Chen Wankai and Shen Hui turned their heads and said in unison, "What?" At this time, Su Chan and Zhou Qin had some understanding, and they whispered together, "Tea." After all, Chen Wankai was a person who had seen the world, and he was a big expert in collecting things. With a light tap from Zi Yuan, he understood and hit his palm with his fist. "Damn it! How could I forget this?" Although Shen Hui still didn't know the specific situation, she was smart and vaguely guessed a little. She tentatively said, "Is it because the tea made from different water is different?" Zi Yuan nodded and said in a low voice, "That's right." In ancient times, in order to make a pot of good tea, the royal family sometimes even specially fetched water from thousands of miles away, or filtered the water from melted snow for thousands of years and brewed it as tea. She looked worriedly at the tea in front of Qian Zhengji and whispered, "I don't know what kind of tea they have prepared for this tea battle." While they were whispering to each other, many people next to them turned their heads and glared at them. Obviously, they were dissatisfied and indignant that they were whispering to each other while a great grandmaster like Qian Zhengji was performing a tea ceremony. Just as Zi Yuan and the others were whispering, the tea in front of Qian Zhengji was gradually steaming. He slowly opened the tea box in front of him and took out a small black round cake. As soon as the small round cake was taken out, there was a low exclamation in the Bus Hen nunnery. Many tea ceremony masters, who had been so calm that they hadn't been moved by Li Yundong's provocative words before, couldn't help but lean forward and widen their eyes at this time. Zi Yuan looked at the small black cake in Qian Zhengji's hand with her mouth agape and said in a daze, "This is impossible." Chen Wankai couldn't help asking, "What is this?" Zi Yuan said in shock, "This is Long Yuan Shengxue from the Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group." Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group? Zhou Qin and Shen Hui asked in confusion. What is the Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group? Is it rare? Is it rarer than the mother tree, Da Hong Pao? What is Long Yuan Shengxue? Su Chan also looked at Zi Yuan in confusion. As a cultivator, she had even seen a powerful magical weapon like the flipping sky seal. Was there anything in the world that could shock people like this? Zi Yuan was also a knowledgeable person. Although she had never seen the flipping sky seal, she had seen powerful magical weapons like the immortal pen and the medicine king tripod every day. Why was she so surprised by a Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group? Seeing that they were at a loss, Zi Yuan smiled bitterly in her heart. She said in a low voice, "The Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group is the king of tea, and it has been lost for 500 or 600 years. The tea we drink now is actually loose tea. This kind of tea is picked from the tea tree and kneaded and processed." During the Han Dynasty, Zhang Ji's Guangyak proposed to process tea and make tea cakes. This situation lasted until the Song Dynasty. The whole country was rich, and the whole country was enthusiastic about the tea ceremony. The production of tea groups reached its peak, among which the Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group was the most famous. This kind of tea group is extremely rare, and it has always been offered only to the emperor. Even the royal family begged the emperor for it, but the emperor was reluctant to give it to them. He was even reluctant to drink it himself. Only when there was a sacrifice in the ancestral temple would he be willing to take out a little. Ouyang Xiu served as an official in the court for 20 years, and then he was rewarded by Song Runzong with a Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group. At that time, Ouyang Xiu was the Minister of Justice and the Minister of War. Such positions were equivalent to the President of the Supreme People's Court, the Procurator General of the Supreme People's Procuratorate, the Minister of Justice, the head of the Law Interpretation Committee, and the Director of the Constitutional Protection Committee, and the Minister of Defense, the Director of the National Mobilization Committee, the Leader of the Commission of Science, Technology and Industry for National Defense, and the Commander of the China People's Armed Police Force and the Minister of Public Security. Such a position could be said to be of high status and great power, but even with such a status, he was never willing to take out the Dragon and Phoenix tea ball to drink. He would only take it out when guests came, to pass it around for everyone to have a look and show off. Chen Wansai's ancestors were all farmers. Only his generation could be considered to have made a fortune and lived a life of luxury. Naturally, he knew the truth of the saying, as an official for 3 generations, you know what to wear and eat. There was an old saying that it took 3 generations to cultivate a noble. It referred to the accumulation of food and living habits over a long period of time, slowly turning into a kind of noble culture. This was far from something that could be learned by a nouveau riche wearing a crown. Chen Wankai knew that his roots were shallow, and he wanted to become a noble and create a noble family with endless incense. Therefore, he was very particular about living. But at this time, he heard that the emperor was reluctant to drink a piece of dragon and phoenix tea group. He only took out a little when there was a sacrifice in the ancestral temple. Ouyang Xiao, who was so powerful, did not even dare to drink it. When guests came, they just looked at it as if they were drawing cakes to appease their hunger. What kind of concept was this? Su Chan, Shen Hui, and Zhou Qin, who came from the second generation of officials, all widened their eyes in shock. Su Chan said, "Then what is the Dragon Garden Shengxue of the Dragon and Phoenix Tea Group?" Zi Yuan shook her head with a look of disbelief on her face and continued, "In the Northern Song Dynasty, the tea competition in China reached its peak. According to the record of Xuanhe Beiyuan tribute tea written by Xiong Fan, the tea groups were replaced by Jingding, Stone Milk, White Milk, and then by the Big Dragon and Phoenix Group. The Big Dragon and Phoenix Group was replaced by the Little Dragon and Phoenix Group, and the Little Dragon and Phoenix Group was replaced by the Miyun Dragon Group, and then the Miyun Dragon Group was replaced by the Rueyun Soaring Dragon Group, and then the Rueyun Soaring Dragon Group was replaced by the White Tea Group." Zi Yuan turned her head and looked at the Dragon Garden Shengxue in Qian Jingji's hands with great shock. She murmured, "Zhang Kejian only used silver water sprout to make the Dragon Garden Shengxue. In the record of Beiyuan tribute tea, tea leaves are divided into 3 grades: purple buds, medium buds, and small buds. The Dragon Garden Shengxue abandoned the purple buds and only picked the small tea tips of the best new tea. Only tea tips shaped like sparrow's tongue, like eagle's claws, and as small as a needle can be called water sprout. In Xiong Fan's record of Xuanhe Beiyuan tribute tea, the medium buds and small buds are all rare and top grade. As for the water sprout, it has never been heard of since ancient times. Look at the Dragon Garden Shengxue in Qian Jingji's hands. It is made of this kind of water sprout that has never been heard of since ancient times. In the process of making it, it is steamed first. After steaming, the ripe buds that have been picked are removed, only the heart is taken, and it is hidden in a precious spring. It is bright and clean, like a silver thread. It is made of a new square inch, with a small dragon winding on it. It is called Dragon Garden Shengxue." Shen Wankai, Shen Hui, Su Chan, and Zhou Qin were all stunned by Zi Yuan's explanation. Shen Hui looked down at the top-grade mother tree Dahong Pao in her hand and stammered, "Then how many Dragon Garden Shengxue can the Dahong Pao in my hand make?" Zi Yuan raised a finger. Su Chan couldn't help but ask, "One? Ah, impossible. Half?" Zhou Qin said, "It can't be a small half, can it? Is it possible that there is not even a small half? 1 or 2? 1 cent? It can't be 1 cent, can it?" Zi Yuan kept shaking her head, and finally said slowly, "I've seen the mother tree Dahong Pao before. There is only 1 tea leaf that is qualified to make Dragon Garden Shengxue. Moreover, only the tip of this tea leaf has to be taken. After it is steamed, it can be decided whether to use it or not." After hearing this, Su Chan and the others were all stunned. Shen Wankai had thought that it was an extremely awesome thing for him to be able to get the mother tree Dahong Pao, which was dozens of times more expensive than gold, in such a hurry. He couldn't help but feel proud in his heart. But at this time, looking at the mother tree Dahong Pao again, he suddenly felt that it was like dung. Su Chan and the others were dumbfounded as they watched Qian Jingji slowly peel off the Dragon Garden Shengxue bit by bit, grind it, and then make tea. They couldn't help but think in their hearts, how much manpower and material resources did it take to make such a small piece of Dragon Garden Shengxue? Ouyang Xiao was already ecstatic when he got a piece of Dragon and Phoenix tea ball. He didn't dare to try it himself. There was a distinguished guest, so he passed it on for fun. What kind of sacred tea would this Dragon Garden Shengxue, which was 2 grades higher than the Dragon and Phoenix tea ball? This was simply unimaginable. For a moment, the Bus Hen Nunnery was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Only the gentle and leisurely sound of tea could be heard. Qian Zhengji elegantly put the crushed and brewed tea leaves into the famous tea set, 1,000 eggplants, and soaked them in boiling water. Immediately, white steam rose in the Bus Hen Nunnery, and dragons and phoenixes could faintly be seen flying in the mist. The mist was white and fragrant. It was really the Dragon Garden Shengxue, with dragons and phoenixes dancing. What are you doing?" You're tuning in to the Xueqi's Martial Arts Saga YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.